Council to turn on your video so I'm able to see those members as we start the meeting. Time is now 7 p.m. As we call the meeting to order, we just acknowledge that the lands on which we're gathered are to the traditional territories of the Coast and Strait Salish peoples, specifically the Lekwungen-speaking people known today as the Esquimalt and Songhees nations, and that their historic connections to these lands continues to this day. Up first, we have the agenda. Just need a motion to approve the agenda. Moved and seconded. Any changes or corrections? Not seeing. Go ahead, Councillor Zelka.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
We can.
Oh, great. Audio check here. I'm a bit concerned with it being a bit overloaded with, and particularly with 6.2, but I'm willing to wait and hold on any possible changes until we get to 6.2. Maybe at the very least a division of the question when we get there. But
okay,
I'm fine for it as it is. Thank you.
Sure. Feel free to make any such requests at that time. Absolutely, Councillor Zelka. So the motion stands, or the agenda stands as it's moved. Any other questions or changes? Not seeing any. All those in favor? Any opposed? Seeing none opposed, that passes. Again, if there's for any reason you are in opposition and I misread your hand, please just speak up at that time and I will re-record for the record. Next up, we have adoption of council minutes of February 22nd. Moved approval. Is there a seconder? Seconded. Thank you very much. Any changes, corrections, additions to those minutes? Seeing none, I'll call the question then. All those in favor? Any opposed? None opposed. Thank you very much. Up next is Mayor's remarks, and I don't have a lot as usual, but I just a couple of things. One, International Women's Day is today, and I just want to express how much I appreciate working with all the women on this council. The 4 women on here are female chief administrative officer. About 3 of 7 directors in the municipality are women. I'm very blessed to have a chance to work with intelligent, capable, strong women day in, day out. But I think if we look around the world, even nationally, the stats in 2020 globally are still pretty shocking. Not a single Fortune 500 company has a female CAO, even in 2021. The rates of pay, representation on boards and corporate leadership and political leadership around the world still far behind. So I think there's lots of work to do. It's nice to celebrate this day and recognize the importance of that, but also recognize there's work still to go. I guess sort of in somewhat tangential, I just want to acknowledge it's became public. It's been a process underway for a while, already changed on the website, but the change of Firefighters Park to Fireman's Park to Firefighters Park. So that the sign came down last week and was expected to go up probably the next week or 2 as it gets built. But I think that's just a typical way that municipalities improve is small ideas get brought forward, they get acted on, and we move forward together. I also just want to recognizing that we're coming up on the 1-year anniversary of the WHO making the formal declaration of the COVID-19 as a global pandemic. And just looking at the huge toll that has taken around the world, I just want to express my thanks to our residents, council staff, everybody who's worked so hard to keep themselves and everybody else safe. We've done well in British Columbia and on the island, and a lot of that is just the daily care and attention that people take. So please keep it up, everyone watching out there. It's critically important as the vaccines are being rolled out to keep doing what we're doing on that front. And I guess last but not least, just to talk about the grant and just to express my thanks to the provincial government for their grant to fund the majority of the chiller costs at our Parks and Recreation. Parks and Rec is an incredibly important part of our community, servicing the entire region. And that donation, that grant is very helpful, not just in terms of health and safety, but in terms of energy efficiency and reduction of carbon impacts as well. So very excited to see that come through. With that, we'll move on to the reports and memorandum. We have a temporary protection order.
Point of information.
Go ahead, Councillor Zelka. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, Council, or sorry, Chair. I would be remiss, or I think we would be remiss if we did not recognize one more rather large women-led organization, which is, in fact, today being Commonwealth Day. And Queen Elizabeth is the head, of course, of the Commonwealth, and she had her announcements today about. This is the only day, by the way, in Canada, which has the Union Jack flying from masts legally. So I just wanted to acknowledge that, and I hope we'll do that together. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Councillor Zelka. And by all means, if anybody wishes, has ideas of things that they would like me to note in my mayor's remarks, please just reach out to me at any time, and I'll try and incorporate those as best I can. Next up, we do have the temporary protection order item 5.1 for 2072 Hampshire Road. I believe we have Mr. Anderson to introduce this, and we have, I think, it's not open for public input, but we have invited the owners of the property to come and speak to us at this time as well. Mr. Anderson, welcome to the meeting.
Thank you, Your Worship, members of council. Yes, we have an application before us for a moving permit for the property at 2072 Hampshire Road. And as part of that, the property is actually on the Community Heritage Register. The move is proposed to take the home from Oak Bay to Metchosin. With the property on the Heritage Register, our procedures bylaw regarding the register requires the director to bring the matter before council, and for council to give consideration to placing a temporary protection order on the property, according to section 606 of the Local Government Act. The subject property, as I note, is on the Heritage Register and is considered to have heritage value. A temporary protection order placed by council would prohibit the removal of the home during the period of this temporary protection order, which is for a maximum of 60 days. This allows council to consider heritage protection for the property, including a heritage designation bylaw. That bylaw would, if adopted by council, would require that a heritage alteration permit was submitted in order to allow for the move of the home to occur. And at that point, council, with the designation in place and consideration of a heritage alteration permit, council could consider whether or not to approve or deny the request to move the home. I should also note for council's information, when considering one of the outcomes of a temporary protection order, it being a heritage designation bylaw, that if the owner does not consent to a heritage designation by council, then the district would be subject to considering financial compensation to the owner based on the impact that a designation may have on the property's market value. So with that, Your Worship, I think I would turn it to council to consider the recommendation that council or that staff provided, and that is that the principal building located at 2072 Hampshire Road be subject to a temporary protection order in accordance with section 606 of the Local Government Act and for a period of 60 days, and that that application be referred to the Heritage Commission for review and recommendation. With that, Your Worship. And I should also, pardon me, I should also note that the statement of significance to place the property on the Community Heritage Register is attached to the report in council's package, and that identifies the value of the subject property. Thank you, Your Worship.
Thank you very much, Mr. Anderson. And I'm just going to take any questions that council might have of staff, and then I'll invite the owners of the property to address council. Go ahead, Councillor Green.
I'm sorry, this muting thing, honestly.
I could see you working at it, so I didn't say anything.
Thank you. Through you, Mayor, or to you, Mayor, I'm just wondering what this question may be premature because I'm not sure what the plan for the property is, and we'll hear that from the owners, I would imagine. But it is certainly a significant piece of property in the heart of Oak Bay and situated in an area very close to services and so on. So that's just my only comment and question, which I can ask the owners, and perhaps they'll include that in their remarks. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Rain. Any other questions of staff at this time? I don't see any. So with that, I'll invite, I believe his name is Corwin, one or two people, I'm not entirely clear, to address council if they so wish. I see at least one person with that name. I see yes. Lucas Corwin and Todd Corwin. So welcome, Mr. Corwin.
Thank you very much, Mayor. Thank you. And good evening, Mayor and councillors. Can everyone hear me clearly?
We can. You sound great. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. So I was advised to keep my video off, which makes complete sense. And so I'll do that and just speak if that's okay with all of you.
It's great. Welcome.
Great, thank you. So, Mayor and Council, my name is Lucas Corwin, and I'm the executor of my father's estate, and I'm also the registered owner of 2072 Hampshire. So thank you to all of you for the opportunity to address you about 2072 Hampshire, which was our late father's house and property. And thank you especially since I understand that the reports and memoranda portion of your agenda aren't strictly speaking subject to, or aren't subject to speaking from public input. So thank you. We very much appreciate that. And I will keep my comments brief, but believe that you will want to hear my family's perspective on the motion that you're considering. And just by way of personal background, I was born and raised in Oak Bay. I've spent the majority of my life here. My wife and I and our children live on Drive Street, just a couple blocks away from 2072. And tangentially, it's wonderful to hear Mayor Murdoch's comments about Fireman's Park and the renaming of that to Fireperson's Park. I played baseball there as a kid and took my girls there to play when they were growing up. So that's wonderful wonderful news. Back into my family, my parents died leaving 5 heirs. My brother Todd, who also hopes to speak tonight, a sister, and then 2 other brothers. And all of us love the property at 2072 and also dearly love the house that's on that property. Unfortunately, as you might understand, given the value of the property, none of us are in a position to buy it. Our only option is to sell it. And in fact, we have entered into an agreement that would see us sell the property, and the purchaser's plan, which they are actively exploring with the municipality right now, would see them create 4 new lots out of the existing property. That said, Todd, who will speak in a moment, and I and all of our siblings, we love the house. I grew up in that house. My 3 children, and in fact, my parents, close to 15 grandchildren, also love that house and have very fond memories of it. So while we need to sell the property, we have come up with a way to preserve the house. And our plan is to move the house to my brother's property in the Chosen, where he and his family will have it as their principal residence. If I could try to put myself in your shoes and think about this issue from council's perspective, the way I think about it is that our plan sees the house staying intact and in the region. It also creates more housing in Oak Bay if the purchaser's plans go ahead, as well as more infrastructure as part of that development. And it expands the municipality's tax base. So we are trying to find a way to benefit the family, honor the house, and also benefit the community. So I truly hope that that the council does not put a protection order on this house, simply because we have what we feel is a really good plan in place that accomplishes those objectives, and we want to be able to continue to pursue that plan. So with that, that's my comments, and I'll turn it over to my brother Todd, who'd like to talk a little more about his plan for moving the house, as well as comment briefly on the report that you have about the house, because there have in fact been a number of significant renovations to the house since the 1990s when I was living there, and it is not the same house that it was 100 years ago. So with that, if I may, Mayor, I'll turn it over to my brother.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Corwin, and welcome, Mr. Corwin.
Thank you, Your Worship and Council. Audio check first, please.
We can hear you, but you're a little quiet. If you could just speak up a little bit, that would be helpful.
I'll move closer to my laptop. Thank you very much, Your Worship and Council, for allowing Lucas and I for an audience this evening. I won't go over the things that Lucas all mentioned because
Can't hear, Mr. Mayor.
Oh, you can't hear, Councillor Nay? Okay, I've got a clear audio in my ear, but it's quiet. Mr. Corwin, could you just speak a little louder, a little closer to the microphone?
Yes. How is this?
It's better. Okay. Yeah. If you just keep that volume up. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'll move closer to my laptop. My apologies. This is my laptop, and as I mentioned to Lucas, I sometimes have issues with Zoom meetings, and I don't know why. Very briefly, why I wish to move the house. Of course, it's, as Lucas mentioned, it's in our family. It's also the house defined my parents as who they were. My wife and I were looking to replace our house in the Chosen. Our house is at end of life, and we felt that this was a natural progression to keep our parents' house and our family. I spoke with Bruce Anderson last week. Very gracious man. Thank you, Mr. Anderson. Gave me a lot of very good information about the protection order and also about a recent Oak Bay News article and some discrepancies. I asked Mr. Anderson if he thought that these issues might be important to this meeting. He said it probably would, so I'll speak briefly and I won't go into much detail. But there are some errors in the Oak Bay, there are some errors in the news article that was recently posted in Oak Bay News. My parents' house has been substantially renovated since they purchased it in 1984. The renovations occurred in 1987, 1988, and again in 2018 when our mother fell and was badly injured. We decided that she needed to come sleep downstairs as opposed to onto the second floor. Approximately 1/2 of the entire house has been renovated. The entire second floor has been renovated. The possible former hut that the Oak Bay News article refers to was renovated and is now a galley kitchen and living room. There's a small laundry room on the north side of the house that was converted to a ground floor shower room and laundry for our mother. The stairs leading to the second floor have been reversed. One of the 3 fireplaces that remain, one of the 3 fireplaces that were mentioned in the article remain. The other 2 have been, one was removed and the other was decommissioned. The main fireplace was completely torn down and rebuilt. The article also mentioned that the original wainscoting inside the house exists. To my knowledge, I don't believe that any of the original wainscoting exists. I believe it was all replaced. The entire roof, new and existing, that was re-roofed in 1987, 1988 with shingles, and 2 patios have been installed where there were none in the past. Also, the article mentioned that there were some substantial trees that may be removed. There's actually only 2. There's 2 birch trees. They're identified as close to the end of life by your Oak Bay arborist. And those are the only 2 that would have to be removed for the move. There's a beautiful Chinese elm down at the bottom of the driveway, basically right at the juncture of Hampshire and Musgrave. And I basically told Nickel Brothers that if that had to be removed, I would not move the house because that was a significant landmark in Oak Bay, especially when we moved here back in 1969. So that's the history that we have of the house, and I will. That's basically all that I have to mention. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Corwin. Can I ask a quick question for you? This is a consideration of a 60-day protection order to get some additional advice from the Heritage Commission. Is there a timeline for moving that the additional or the next 60 days would impact?
Todd, let me speak to that if you don't mind.
Please.
Go ahead, Mr. Corwin.
Yeah, thank you, Your Worship. So yes, the deal will close at the end of, or is scheduled to close at the end of June. And Todd has been diligently pursuing the applications, all the permitting that is needed to move the house with the municipality. And 60 days will push that deadline back significantly. We don't have those permits in place. The municipality is still considering them.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Corwin. Are there any questions of the owners at this time before we discuss the option here in front of us? I'm not seeing any. I think you guys, the 2 of you, did a great job of explaining the history and the background of this particular of the house. And I certainly, if council decides to refer it, would invite you back to speak to the Heritage Commission, who also considers these factors into their recommendation as well. But at this point, we'll just bring it back into council's hands. So thank you to the 2 Mr. Corwins for your input. And at this point, we'll end the public input portion and come back to council, where we will consider the recommendation. And at this point, there's no motion on the table, but we can entertain a motion to speak to the motion, or we can just have some questions if there's any further questions. Go ahead, Councillor Braithwaite.
Thank you, Mayor. Yeah, I do have a couple of questions just on a couple of things that were touched on in the presentation. Number one was the trees, and I'm just wondering if staff can perhaps touch on the number of trees that would be removed, because I do note that in the staff report, they did talk about require the removal of trees on the site, and Mr. Corbin said basically 2 trees, and I'm just wondering if staff can confirm that.
Thank you, Councillor Braithwaite. Mr. Anderson, have you had that level of detail of assessment done so far?
There has been some material prepared by our arborist. My recollection is that there are, as noted, the 2 trees that are impacted by the move. But I would also like to note that there's a significant elm tree on the boulevard. My understanding is that certainly care and attention will need to be paid in terms of ensuring that the move of the home doesn't impact that boulevard tree as well. That's about all the information I have available right now, Your Worship. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Councillor Braithwaite.
Yes, thank you. And my second question is, there was talk about the permits that are required. And I believe Mr. Corwin said that they were looking at doing something, closing everything by the end of June. In my mind, if we did a 60-day on this property, would we not be able to have in place the permits ready to go at the end of the 60 days, so that in actual fact, it wouldn't push the date of the end of June back at all?
I'll give it to Mr. Anderson to answer as best he can.
Yeah, thank you, Your Worship. We have the permit applications before us for a move and for a demolition of the foundation. Those are not significant permits in terms of time issuance. They're basically conditions that need to be met by the applicants. So I would anticipate those permits could be issued fairly soon. So 60-day protection order would represent a delay in the issuance of those permits. And I would estimate by approximately a month or 30 days delay in terms of the impact. Thank you, Your Worship.
Thank you, Mr. Anderson. Are there any other questions of staff? Go ahead, Councillor Appleton, and then Councillor Green.
Thank you, Your Worship. I'm just wondering, and this maybe, I think it's just more appropriate to place it to staff, but I'm just wondering about the, in situations that have cropped up that are similar to this over the last couple of years, there's been the evaluation of the possibility of if the intent longer term is to potentially subdivide the land and it is appropriate for subdivision, then to what extent was a heritage revitalization agreement associated with the subdivision evaluated for this property? So I understand from the proponents that that they had a discussion with Mr. Anderson. So I'm just wondering whether he's in a position to speak to that.
Thank you, Councillor Appleton. Mr. Anderson.
Thank you, Your Worship. And what I can tell you is that I have not had any discussions with the proponents in terms of the purchase and the future subdivision of the property. I have had discussions with the current owners, and I should note that I guess I should note there hasn't been any discussion with respect to the potential of looking at a heritage revitalization agreement as part of a subdivision process, but I would suggest that is an opportunity. Thank you, Your Worship.
Okay, thank you. Nothing else, Councillor Green?
Thank you. Councillor Appleton answered my question. Thank you. I'm sorry, Councillor Appleton's question. You know what I mean.
I understand completely. Go ahead. I have, Councillor Nate, did I see your hand flash up there?
Well, I didn't really, but I was mulling a question. Through you, Mayor, to staff then, Mr. Anderson, I'm just kind of curious about, if let's say council was interested in considering the value of an HRA on this property, how would that process unfold?
Mr. Anderson, can you,
Thank you, Your Worship.
review for us that process?
One thing I should first mention is that the process associated with the temporary protection order is for council to give some direction in terms of looking at heritage protection for the property. One of those, and the main avenue when we're in a situation like this, is for council to be considering a heritage designation bylaw. A secondary could be to return to the property owners, and that would be the first stop for staff regardless, and to speak to what the options might be in terms of if council's given a temporary protection order, what kind of direction we might be able to take to try and accommodate some form of protection, whether or not that's proceeding with the designation or perhaps reconsidering the move permit application, perhaps the option of looking at a heritage revitalization agreement. But I should, to speak to the point of the HRA, that is something that we would need to see an application from the owner or an authorized agent to sort of pursue that. So we can speak to it with the owners, but we can't initiate that without the owner or unauthorized purchaser submitting such an application.
Right. And just a point of clarification, if I may, Mr. Mayor, to staff. In terms of timeline, if it was the will of council to issue a temporary protection order, I'm a little confused about the timeline in terms of the benefit to the owners of the property. Does the issuing of the permits, as you described them, Mr. Anderson, intrude on the ability of the owner to move the property as they've discussed with us?
Mr. Anderson?
If I understand the question correctly, it's would the temporary protection order impact the owner's ability to sell the property? Is that the question?
No,
Yeah.
to move the house according to the timelines the owner described.
So I believe the answer to that is yes. It would represent, as I estimated, probably about a 1 month delay in terms of the real process, because again, we've got a process. We've got a moving permit application before us, so that needs to be processed. If we had a temporary protection order placed, my estimate is if that was the only thing that was in place, that would represent a 1 month delay to the owners. If something additional occurs, that's a different process and represents a different delay or time frame for the owners.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Ney. I have Councillor Zelka, then Patterson.
Thank you, Chair. I guess just starting from a fairness place, since you gave the proponents a chance to speak, however, there isn't really a public forum in a council, at least under our current procedures bylaws. I'm very interested in actually moving forward with this 60-day aspect, primarily because I wish to hear from the public. While I've received a number of emails already of people who are quite attached to this property and to the heritage and historical aspects of it, I'm very much interested in seeing all voices being heard on this item. That's number one. Number two is I'm actually rather intrigued that an HRA might be possible. Who knows, maybe as part of the 60-day process that might unfold, especially if we end up designating the house or as part of the later process. I do wish to also ask, is it reasonable, since we've spoken about the trees that might be affected for a move, can we talk, or do we have any sense of what trees might be affected with respect to a subdivision of 4 properties? Because this property is quite well treed. And I imagine that with a 4-lot subdivision, we would lose quite a fair bit of green space and coverage.
I don't think those questions you're raising are answerable here in the sense that that application process hasn't been initiated. And I think Mr. Anderson said he just has the preliminary, which is just those 2 trees and the need for protection of the boulevard elm.
With respect to the move only. Yeah, but it's helpful to know that that is a potential 4-lot subdivision is being considered. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Patterson, you had a question or more?
Get to the unmute. Thank you. Yes, thank you, Mayor. And the question through you for Mr. Anderson really is, I notice on the statement of significance that the location of the house on the large property and the large property itself is quite a significant element of the statement of significance. And this is something certainly that would, if we make the referral to the Heritage Commission, they would have to consider. But for a heritage revitalization that actually divided the property into smaller lots, how might that impact the statement of significance when the property itself as a farm property is to the overall heritage significance of the building on the land?
I'll give that to Mr. Anderson, but it may be a question better suited for the Heritage Commission to answer with that level of expertise. Mr. Anderson?
Yes, Your Worship, thank you. One thing I do need to mention is that what we have before us is a temporary protection order consideration that's associated with the property being on the Community Heritage Register. And we don't have before us a subdivision application. And so it's difficult for staff to speak to that, I think, in this context. But the other thing I wanted to mention, if I may, Councillor Zelka had noted that an opportunity for public input. I just wanted to be clear that the public input in a process associated with the protection order is really associated if council receives a recommendation and considers bylaws for a heritage designation bylaw. That would then lead us to a public hearing, and that's where there would be an opportunity for public comment in this process. So just to clarify that, yes, there would be a referral to Heritage Commission. But to go back to the original question, it is very difficult to sort of speculate on how, for example, the subdivision or a possible HRA would be viewed or reviewed in the context of the statement of significance and the placement of that property on the register. My understanding is that it's on this register in Maine to do with the significance of and meaning of the home on that property. And the property itself is a very small remnant of an original farm in Oak Bay. Thank you, Your Worship.
Thank you, Mr. Anderson. Go ahead,
Thank
Councillor
you.
Patterson.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. And if I could just continue on that, all of the renovations that Mr. Corwin described that had been carried out by the owners over the last couple of decades were carried out without review by the Heritage Commission, I gather, because the building was not a designated building in Oak Bay, or would it, or was there any requirement for review by Heritage for any of those renovations?
Thank you, Councillor Patterson. I think, Mr. Anderson, when was this placed on the Heritage Register?
Yes, thank you, Your Worship. It was not placed on the register until 2007. And so there wouldn't have been any requirement to have a look at those when the renovations were coming forward. In my understanding, it's the late 80s and the mid 90s where renovations were undertaken. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Anderson. I just have one question for my clarification of process. How are designation bylaws applied outside of the municipality, i.e., if Oak Bay was to apply a designation bylaw to the house to capture the value of the house and allow it to move to Machosen, does the designation follow, or is that purely a local government designation piece? Mr. Anderson?
Thank you, Your Worship. Yes, it would be designated by the municipality for the municipality in the municipality. So if it was to be considered for designation and chosen, it would have to go through a process with that council. Thank you.
That's helpful. Thank you, Mr. Anderson. I don't see any other hands up for questions, so we just need
Jay,
some direction
just-
from. Go ahead, Councillor Braithwaite.
Sorry, Mayor. Just something that Councillor Patterson was asking about the dates of the.
You're muted.
You just muted. Yeah. Welcome
I
back.
thought I heard Mr. Corwin say that one of the renovations was made in 2016. I thought I heard. So just to question that.
Okay. I don't. Is it germane to the decision to refer this or not?
Probably not. I was just going to a point that Councillor Patterson was talking about whether or not it would have had to have gone through staff to be able to have a renovation done on it.
Right. Mr. Anderson, what, just for everybody's clarification, for a house that is on the Heritage Register, and this was put on by council resolution in 2007, for someone in ownership of a house of that on the register, are they is there any triggers there that that get applied or review of any renovations that take place?
Thank you, Your Worship. There would be a review undertaken if the renovations impacted any of the items that are identified in the statement of significance in terms of character defining elements for the building. And so I can't speak to the actual renovation in 2016, but my suspicion is it didn't impact heritage elements, but I can't speak with certainty on that. Thank you, Your Worship.
Thank you, Mr. Anderson. I don't see any other questions, so we can take a motion and then we can speak to the motion.
I'm prepared to make the motion as per the staff report to place a temporary protection order on 2072 Hampshire Road.
Second.
That's moved and seconded. Is there any further discussion on that? Councilor Braithwaite, do you want to speak to? No. Okay, go ahead.
No.
Okay, go ahead, Councilor Nay.
To the motion, if we did that and it was referred to the Heritage Commission, Mr. Mayor, I have a question to staff.
Go ahead, please.
Can I? May I?
Yes, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, I'm back to the HRA thing. Can we ask the commission? No, I'm still confused about the way that the process would, like, if we made the referral, could we also ask staff to talk with the applicant about, a consideration around an HRA and have that information come back to council? Is that something that could happen under this process?
Thank you, Councilor Nay. I don't think we can require it, but we can ask. Mr. Anderson?
Yes, Your Worship. I think, as I mentioned, the HRA would be associated with the subdivision of the property. Certainly, we would be having a conversation with the owner if a temporary protection order is put in place, and we could explore that as well as their perspective on a heritage designation bylaw, which would be the primary method that we'd advance in terms of further protection on the property as part of the protection order. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Nay. Is there any other discussion on this, on the motion? Go ahead, Councilor Zelka.
Thank you very much, Chair. A question through you to staff. I don't know whether it's relevant or not, but possibly touching on the HRA possibility. Is this a building a candidate for possibly relocation on the same property? Or would that be basically a separate discussion?
Mr. Anderson?
I would say it has the potential for that. I mean, certainly not something that obviously the owners have presented to us, but I would suggest that should we be going back to speak with the owners, we can speak with them about all of the options, gain their perspective on that, and then we can have that information brought forward potentially as part of the information that would go to the Heritage Commission. Thank you.
And if I may ask one more question, please, through you to staff.
Go ahead, Councillor Zelter.
I understand the Bowker Creek heads through a conduit either through this property or beside this property. I just was wondering, at times we talk about daylighting. I don't think that daylighting might be appropriate in this case, but will that Bowker Creek existence be an issue here, or is this something that's part of the character defining aspect?
Yeah, I don't think it's not adjacent to this particular property. It was adjacent to the original Todd or Bowker farm, but that's not this building. That reference in the statement of significance refer to the Bowker farmhouse, not this house. Councillor Green.
Yes, thank you. And I just wanted to ask through you, Mayor, has the property sold, or the current owners, Mr. The Corwins, they still technically own the property, or has the property sold? Thank you.
Mr. Anderson.
Yeah. Your Worship, my understanding is that there is a purchase agreement that closes, I believe the owner had indicated June. So there is an agreement for purchase and sale on the property.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Green. I don't see any other discussion or questions at this point. Before I call the question, I will just make a statement. I'm supportive of this going to the Heritage Commission. I think it's important for us to consider, get that level of expertise on this property and to understand the merits and the heritage components of it. That being said, this strikes me as one of these heritage buildings that is tied up so much in the family history of this family and the consideration that they want to continue its use in the family, maybe on a different site. It does strike me as an important consideration as the overall discussion. So I'm looking forward to hearing back from the Heritage Commission on their intake of that and the expertise that's there. And I think when it comes back to this table, it'll be an interesting discussion to see what options are available. Councillor Braithwaite.
I'm sorry, Mayor. I just a question. If this does go through for the 60-day, my understanding would be that after it's been looked at by the Heritage Commission and comes back to us, that could actually be less than 60 days. It could be 30 days, perhaps. And then if this goes through, it could be lifted.
That is correct. And I think we'll make every effort, as always, to move it along quickly. We are in the process of just spooling up our new Heritage Commission. So I don't want to give undue expectations just given that timeline, but absolutely, we always try and do our best to make that as expedient as possible. I don't see any other comments at this point, so I'll call the question. All those in favor? Anyone opposed? None opposed. So that will go to the Heritage Commission and come back to Council for consideration, certainly within 60 days, likely, as Councillor Braithwaite pointed out, considerably sooner than that. To the two Mr. Corwins, thank you so much for coming and speaking to us. That the context you shared is incredibly important, and certainly invite you to remain in this process and share your stories through that process. With that, we'll move on to item number 6.1, reports and memorandums. This is Mr. Payne's show, our Director of Finance. So I'll invite him to join us at this point. Just for the record, we have all of the items in this area, except for the newly moved in 6.5, which is just a notice of motion from Councillor Patterson, are all subject to public input. So what I'll do is I will invite members of the public to come forward and speak on the agenda items as they come forward. We've had a number of people who have pre-registered on various parts of this, so I'll call them first, but then we'll just make the general call to the public. And if I could just ask Ms. Williams, as we do that, if we could post I'll let the public know the link to the Zoom and the phone and number are both available on the agenda package. But also we'll try and put them up on screen as well and as we invite people to call in. So with that, Mr. Payne, item 6.1, the draft financial plan overview. You have a presentation to bring us back up to speed of where we are today.
Yes, thank you, Your Worship. I'm just going to share my screen here. I've prepared just an abbreviated version of the presentation that Council and the public have seen over the last 3 budget deliberation meetings. in an effort to get to our capital budget tonight. So we'll discuss briefly some of the budget principles, the remaining budget timeline, the draft financial plan overview, some further information on asset management and their reserves, and we'll talk about our final capital budgets, the Parks, Rec and Culture, and Engineering and Public Works capital budget today. There are some relatively significant changes from the last meeting, so we highlight them at the top of the meeting. We've populated a version control page at the beginning of the financial plan for easy reading for folks that are trying to follow the versions. The amount of developer contributed revenue has changed. There was an error in the previous version that said that approximately $232,000 of our budget would be from developer contributed revenue for our capital budget, but in fact it was $186,000, so that's been revised. The district has been awarded a grant for its Oak Bay Rec Center chiller application, and so the funding source for that capital budget has been revised to capital grants. We've integrated and introduced a facilities contingency into the Engineering and Public Works capital plan, and there is a mid-size hydrovac unit replacement placed in the Public Works equipment replacement capital plan. And lastly, we've separated in the financial plan our asset management section and provided a bit of further context in terms of asset management progress. The narrative so far has been largely concentrated around what we're calling sustainable infrastructure funding, but there's further context that the community should be aware of. So we've created a separate section in the financial plan to help populate that context. So the budget principles that we've been operating under, we've been budgeting based on the service level approach, and service levels is directed by council. We are aligning funding sources with appropriate expenses. So ongoing operating expenses are funded by ongoing operating revenues, and infrequent or large expenses are funded by reserves. Projects that were budgeted for in last year's financial plan continue on, and any funding that was unspent from the previous financial plan has been carried over. This 5-year financial plan is authorization for spending for the full 5 years, but particularly important for council to consider the current year and the next year if operations are to continue right through to January next year, and until the financial plan is adjusted in the spring of 2022. Life cycle costing information has been integrated for new capital assets. And just a reminder that the financial plan document itself is not a statutory document. It's a document prepared by staff to provide additional transparency to the community and council. So how do things appear in the financial plan? Of course, staff have integrated council approved service levels and council directed initiatives and interpretation of action needed to implement council endorsed plans. So if there's master plans that are endorsed by council, staff action those master plans and integrate the financial implications of those plans in the financial plan. And staff don't unilaterally increase service level or decrease service levels without asking council what they want, unless a service level increase or decrease is legislated. Public input is welcome at every stage. The draft financial plan is prepared in its entirety from day one, so that council and public can make decisions in the entire financial plan context. Council direction is integrated into financial plan, and we ensure to maintain different versions as we move through. Current timeline, right now, we're at the end of the presumed timeline, which is to wrap up a budget today. If council provides direction today to prepare the financial plan bylaw, then staff will prepare the financial plan bylaw for adoption April through May, with a statutory deadline of May 14th for adoption. So council decision making occurs at every stage of the budget presentation, but even before that, the budget itself is basically a point in time, an accumulation of council direction at a point in time. So even if this financial plan is prepared and brought to council for adoption, council can still provide direction to change that budget, and those changes will be reflected as best as possible into future iterations. Staff will amend the draft financial plan according to the resolutions that came to us from committee and now at this council meeting. And as mentioned, council can provide direction that has budget impact after budget deliberation. So for instance, if council has receipt of new information after the financial plan bylaw has been adopted and council wishes to direct staff to adjust the budget for 2022, that resolution will be integrated into the next version of the financial plan and actioned accordingly. So I just want council not to feel like it's a be all and end all. There's always an ability for staff to think creatively to fund and action direction from council. So the financial plan overview is as follows. A 5-year operating expenditures are estimated to exceed $220 million, with the capital expenditures, if fully executed, to be $84 million. Much of that is grant funding contingent, the big one being the upland sewer separation project. 5 million of it would be borrowing, and the majority of it would be from reserves, with a small part from fees and charges. Some risks to the financial plan in the course of COVID-19, and for instance, the Parks, Rec and Culture net revenue in 2020 was reduced by $1.1 million. We forecasted a net revenue reduction of $2.5 million for 2021 when compared to the original budget in 2020. In 2020, for instance, there was incremental COVID-19 expenses of over $450,000, and investment revenue forecasts have been revised downward by $2.5 million over the 5-year plan as a result of the financial investment income impact. Reserves are at risk. We have approximately $50 million in reserves, but their forecasted balance is impacted by investment return being downgraded, as well as the fact that we still have capital grants that are outstanding. And if those capital grants are not successful, then one of the only other funding sources really is for reserves or borrowing. And then we have many asset management plans that are underway or plan to be underway. One of the big unknowns is the facilities master plan, which will likely identify more deferred maintenance and further populate our capital plan, or at least recommended by staff. Collective bargaining for fire and police are underway. We have integrated a forecast increase into the financial plan, but that could change at any moment. Tax increase for 2021, according to the draft financial plan right now, is 6.49%, or $208 to the median residential property. That's made up primarily of forced growth, which is actually made up of primarily reduced revenue forecasts, not increase in expenses. Expenses have actually not increased significantly because of the deflationary environment we're in for some time. Additionally, there's funding for infrastructure, annual infrastructure, as well as new staffing. And we've outlined how the mix of the forecasted increase over the next 5 years are impacted by those main components as well. And we've identified how much a median residential property would expect to pay an increase for those components. This information is presented in the financial plan for review by anybody who would like to have a look at that. So I'm just going to breeze by some of our reserves. We've talked about in the past what reserves can mean. This is our approximate reserve balance. We're just working our way through year end at the moment, but we're forecasting basically a year end balance of our reserves of $56 million. This financial plan decreases that reserve balance by $12.5 million to $44 million by 2025. That's if we spend every single dollar of every single operating budget and every single capital budget. So in all likelihood, it won't be reduced by that much, but this provides maximum spending authority to this impact. Much of that, however, would be reserves that we would want to see decline because they are for a specific purpose. So for instance, we have a COVID-19 restart grant that has been so far allocated to forecasted net revenue decreases at the Parks, Rec, and Culture Department, maintain operations there, as well as our uplands sewer separation. So this gray line here is mostly composed of our upland sewer separation reserve. And if we're successful with the grant and we move forward with the spending, that reserve is always expected to go to zero. So that $12.5 million reduction in our reserve balance, much of it is expected and would be welcomed in many respects. Your Worship, that will conclude the overview budget. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Payne. This section is not, there's no motion required. We're just here to kind of provide the context for the overall budget discussion. I will ask if there's anybody from the public who wishes to speak or address us at this point. And not to worry if you're a little slow hitting the button or putting up your hand, we will come back to the public at every line item, and you can always go back and ask questions. It's the same staff essentially walking through each of these different components with a bit of line item expertise in terms of engineering or other departments. So the numbers are there. I'm going to wait a few seconds here to see if anybody does call in. Again, if you're calling into the phone number, you have to hit *9 to raise your hand. We'll see that here and we'll welcome you into the meeting. If you're in Zoom, you can just click on the raise hand portion, which is under reactions on the bottom of your Zoom screen, and you can raise your hand there. Ms. Williams, is there anybody from the public who has raised their hand or indicated their request to speak to item 6.1?
Nobody at this time, Your Worship.
Okay, thank you. We'll move on to item 6. Is there any questions of council? Councillor Zelka, you had a question or comment?
Yes, thank you very much, Chair. I guess a general roll-up question, if I may, especially with that $520,000 grant that I'm very grateful that we received relating to the Oak Bay Rec Center chiller. Has the receiving of a grant like that, or have any of these changes generally affected the overall tax expected proposed tax increase? Or where are we at with respect to the tax increase?
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Zelka. Mr. Payne?
Your Worship, the chiller at the Oak Bay Rec Center was originally, was proposed to be funded by reserve. So really what it's done is improved our reserve forecast. I reported a $12.5 million reserve forecast decline over the next 5 years. You could basically adjust that to $12 million as a result of that grant.
Thank you, Mr. Payne. Councillor Patterson.
Yes, thank you.
I'm sorry. There was a second part of the question, if I may.
Go ahead, Councillor Zelka.
Where are we at in terms of the tax increase? I think it was 6.52 or something last time.
Yes, Your Worship, I apologize. 6.49.
So 649. Thank you. Go ahead, Councillor Patterson.
Yes, thank you. And I was going to ask the same question as Councillor Zelka. $500,000 is a considerable amount of money, and we're very grateful. I think appreciate the work the staff did in securing that. I'm just wondering if Mr. Payne could briefly review how he establishes the levels of funds that will be in the reserves, how he makes a determination between minimum versus optimal balances, and just the process that he uses for that determination.
Sure. Thank you, Councillor Patterson. Mr. Payne.
Your Worship, I haven't set specific targets for minimal or optimal targets for reserve balance. And the reason being is because reserve balance and the appropriateness of it will greatly
Ms. Williams, you have your email popping up on our share screen. There we go. Go ahead, Mr. Payne.
Thank you. Yes, you got distracted there. The appropriate and size of the reserve balance will vary depending on the life cycle of the assets that are being replaced. So for instance, I always use the fire truck reserve as an example. At the beginning of the life cycle of a fire truck, we will be just contributing a small portion per year to that reserve. So the reserve balance will be low. But when it's time to replace that truck, presumably if we've funded it sustainably, that reserve balance is high. And then we purchase that truck and that reserve balance goes down to next to zero. So, I haven't set optimal targets. However, when we do present the infrastructure replacement plan to council, hopefully in this fall, we will be able to tell you where we think the reserve balance should be for the life cycle of all the assets we have right now versus what it is. And that's really what you would call your infrastructure, your cumulative infrastructure deficit, if it's less than where it should be.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Patterson. Are there any other questions? Not seeing any. Ms. Williams, I'll ask again. We've had the number up for a few minutes now. Any members of the public have called in and raised
And
their
no
hand?
members at this time, Your Worship.
Okay. Thank you. As that was just a general overview, we can have lots of chance to delve into some of the details if people wish as well. So we'll move on then to item number 6.2, which is the Council Priority Initiatives, Infill Housing and Village Area Plans. And there's a couple of options or aspects that are being touched on here. Obviously, the goal of that housing framework is to allow for this discussion by the council and the community to look at all these potential housing options. And we're hoping that we can make some decisions here on what allowed housing forms are going to be included and set some direction, and ideally get to the point of setting some of the regulations and even bylaw regulations and guidelines. This doesn't touch on the multi-family corridors to speak of. That's more in the village area plans, but can include part of that. So that's the piece here. And just for people's context at home, this was raised to ask whether or not there was options to move some of this a bit faster at the last meeting. And so that's what's here in front of us, is a report to look at options for consideration. We do have one member of the public. Excuse me, sir, you cannot speak yet. We do have one member of the public who is who is asked, is pre-registered to speak to this item. But first, we're going to get a presentation from staff. We will be taking questions from council, then we'll reach out to the public for questions at that point. So with that, I believe Mr. Anderson, or I'll give it to Mr. Payne and he can hand it off to Mr. Anderson.
Yes, thank you, Your Worship. We were just going to mention briefly, this report is in response to questions from council in terms of the resources and timing around some of the projects, in particular the infill housing project, the village area plan, and the community climate action working group recommendation number 4. So council will recall that at the January 28th priorities meeting, staff were asked to come back with information regarding that, and that's what we've done here. You'll notice that there's no staff recommendation simply because council had asked for some information, and that's what we've provided. But we wanted to provide an opportunity, of course, if council wanted to provide further direction on any of that, and that's why it's appeared on your agenda. Thank you very much, Your Worship.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Payne. Is Mr. Anderson, did you wish to go over the report as well, or just take questions?
One of Your Worship, thank you. If it's council's wish, if I gave just a bit of a brief overview on each of the initiatives that I've spoken to in terms of the staff resources and budget, I'd sort of at council's pleasure on that, Your Worship. Thank you.
I'm looking at council's faces here. I think they probably appreciate a brief overview. I think that's helpful. I think it's helpful for the public who may not wish to read through all these lengthy reports that we do to give a sense of what it is that we're considering here.
All right, thank you, Worship. I will endeavor to be brief. I know there's a big agenda this evening. So, and thank you, Mr. Payne, for introducing this. I'll get right to council has given some direction for staff to bring some information back. And the information that we've got relates to two council priority initiatives, number 4 being that related to infill housing, and number 5 to the village area plan project. So those are two council priority initiatives. We also have some requests for information related to the Community Climate Action Working Group recommendation number 4 that relates to energy reduction programs for new and existing housing. So what staff have provided here is an overview of where we are at and currently with respect to each of those, and what some of the options might be around adding consulting budget or considering additional staff resourcing. So if I can just speak to the infill housing council initiative or priority initiative number 4. Right now we have that as a priority, and it's currently planned to be completed in 2022. Regarding the original timeline, it was for completion in 2021. So the infill housing project itself has got a fairly extensive engagement process envisioned around that as we work our way through where infill housing might land in neighborhoods. The timeframe for this initiative is estimated around 1 year, 12 months, and there is a project budget that involves consultants as well, and it's at $120,000 on that. So staff resources have been allocated for us to see completion of this project on the timeline of the second quarter of 2022. If we're looking at the option of trying to move ourselves toward finishing this in this year, quarter 4, 2021, it's really, and from staff's perspective, not feasible to do that within the project scope that we have before us. For us to even sort of select a consultant and sort of move this along, we're almost going to be into about 8 months to try and complete a 12-month project. And as I think council is well aware, staff resources are allocated now for our 2021 projects and including allocated toward this infill housing project. So really, from a staff's perspective, it's pretty difficult to look at adding budget for consultants or trying to add more staff resources to try and advance a 12-month project in effectively about an 8-month time frame. So one option that we'd like to put forward as an alternative to adding budget or staff resources here is to look at modifying the scope of that infill housing project. And as I mentioned, it was considered to have a fairly extensive engagement process and look at each individual housing type separately as we went through the process of discussing this project with the neighborhoods affected. The approach here is suggested is that we would basically take all of the housing types out together and have an engagement process associated with that. That might allow us to get this into more of a 10-month process. Might get us a little closer to that quarter 1 2022 timeline. So that's the alternative that staff have put forward for infill housing. With respect to council priority initiative number 5, the village area plan, that's planned to be completed in 2023. And the original timeline that we need to speak to here was for completion in 2022. As I noted in the report, the estimated timeframe for this initiative is around 18 months, and there is a current project and consultant budget of $150,000 for this. And staff resources currently are allocated to commence the project in the first quarter of 2022 and looking at completion in the third quarter of 2023. If we look at the original timeline and try and have that done for the fourth quarter of 2022, we'd have to commence this project basically in July of this year of 2021. So in order to do that, the option that's put forward in terms of sort of increasing the consultant budget for this and having project management in the majority of the project handed over to a consultant to conduct, that option is noted in the memo would be an additional $50,000 added to the project. As I noted, staff resources aren't allocated for this project. For us to add staff, we're basically looking at trying to find additional staff that would serve a 300-hour project management primarily function. And so we're basically saying it's not practical to add staff resources for this. And the other comment I'd like to make is that I think there is a risk with simply adding consulting budget and having the majority of the project run by a consultant, you're basically at risk of losing your local knowledge and your community experience that your planning staff bring to the project. And I think there's a concern I'll just flag from staff's perspective that we would take that approach where we basically just retain a consultant to take over the whole project. And the third item that I will speak to just briefly is the Community Climate Action Working Group recommendation number 4. This is not currently identified as a council priority initiative. And as I noted, it is to create programs associated policies to accelerate greenhouse gas and energy reductions for existing buildings and for new building construction. So what staff have done to look at implementing this as a priority initiative, we've estimated that there'd be about 100 hours of staff time needed to deliver a program that was ready for implementation. As I note again, staff time is currently allocated to other 2021 projects. So the option that staff have presented here is that council could consider an increase to the budget, allocating $20,000 and have this program prepared by a consultant with staff retaining the consultant and with a little bit of oversight to make that happen. So that's in a nutshell, Your Worship, summary of the report that I've provided to council. And I invite any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Anderson. I think that's always helpful just to give an overview in that sense. Are there questions of staff on any of these three? I think all three should be open for discussion at this point. And if we want to, I can narrow down some of that discussion if we get too scattered. Any questions of staff? Go ahead, Councillor Zelka, and then Councillor Patterson.
Oh, thank you very much, Chair. With respect to the third item, the Climate Action Working Group recommendation number 4, I guess I was a bit surprised when seeing it that it says that this is not currently identified as a council priority initiative. For some reason, I thought it was, and I guess maybe with all the priorities been flying by and wonderful reports, and initiatives have numbers and these recommendations have numbers, and I may have gotten them mixed up. What process would we have to follow to get this recommendation 4 moved into and be considered as a council priority?
Thank you, Councillor Zelka. I'll turn to Mr. Payne for that one. I think the answer is we put it in the budget. Mr. Payne?
Your Worship, I believe there's a protocol with respect specifically to strategic priorities. And I forget exactly what it is, but I believe staff need to be given the opportunity to provide the resourcing implications of including that in the priorities. Annually, we have our strategic priorities meeting. I believe staff are recommending to bring that meeting forward, so it's in the fall, so it can better align with the financial plan in this winter and early spring.
Thank you, Mr. Payne. Councillor Zelka?
And so I do understand that that we have that priority planning right at the very beginning of the process, and I do apologize. I may have missed this one. But I do appreciate the fact that staff is recommending at least a few dollars potentially being thrown at it within this budget cycle as a way of moving forward on this rather important item relating to our climate emergency declaration. And I would hope that at least this item we would consider. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Zelka. I have Councillor Patterson, then Braithwaite.
Yes, thank you, Mayor, and through you to Mr. Anderson, I think. And thank you for the report, Mr. Anderson. I appreciate that the staff have reviewed options to perhaps expedite some of these processes. Just a question to see if I understand what has been presented. On the infill housing, there's a recommendation to perhaps change the scope and reduce the time frame so that the project could be completed closer to Q1 in 2022, but it did say that following that process, there was still a separate process to adopt any implementation measures resulting from the project, including the policy criteria, design guidelines, and regulatory zoning bylaws. So that piece of work, then, am I to understand that work will be done on completion, so that at Q1 2022, with the first piece completed, then the next part would start? Or optimally, will it all be wrapped up into the completion to end with Q1 2022? Just clarification, please.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Patterson. Mr. Anderson?
Yes, thank you, Your Worship. That is correct. The infill project that we're talking about would take us to a point where council could receive the information and give direction to then have staff prepare the necessary implementation items as mentioned in that memo. So it would be a part 2, if you will, and subject to council directing staff to go ahead and start to work on the bylaws and policies that you would then consider approving as part of that second round, if you will.
Thank you. And just continuing on that, is there an estimate of the time that would be required for that piece of the process? And you know what I'm trying to get to here is what would be the rollout, the anticipated rollout for this infill housing?
Thank you, Councillor Patterson. I think it goes straight to the heart of people need, the point of having these guidelines would be certainty and clarity for people. So until the regulations catch up with the intent, there's that limbo period. So Mr. Anderson, do you have a sense of the time frame from, I guess it depends a bit on the complexity of the implementation, but some sense of how long that would take?
Yes, Your Worship, and you're right, depending on the housing types that council gives direction for us to implement. But I would estimate about a 6-month time frame to put that information together and have that come before council for considering of, for example, adoption of bylaws. So it could be in prep for council's consideration later in 2022. It really does, if I may, depend on whether council wants to direct that to be brought forward as part of the broader housing framework implementation package, or brought forward, if you will, in the separate pieces that we've been working on. So thank you, Your Worship.
Thank you. Anything else, Councillor Patterson?
Yes, just one last question. In the engagement process with the public, if we could just clarify perhaps the intent of the nature of that engagement with the public. It does seem that we have been at this process for a while. So I'm just wondering what additional information staff would be seeking to move this forward.
Thank you, Councillor Patterson. Mr. Anderson?
Thank you, Your Worship. I think Councillor Patterson, you're really speaking to the intent and the scope of this, and it really is to explore the opportunities for different housing types and neighborhoods. And so, as part of the engagement to do that, we would be preparing a whole slate of information associated with those housing types and bringing that to the neighborhoods, to the community, and seeking their advice and input on what those opportunities represent, and what are the implications. And so the process is really around informing and then having the community sort of respond and provide some comments and advice on their perspective on what it is we might be allowing in neighborhoods in terms of those different housing types. So that's really the crux, if you will, of that public engagement component of the project.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Patterson. I have Councillor Braithwaite, and then I had Green. The hand is down now, but I'll go back there if it's back up. Once those councillors have spoken, if there's no more hands, I'll go to the public. It might be worthwhile, Ms. Williams, just to put the the phone number to call in. We have one registered speaker, that's a Mr. Wilmot, and then we'll go to others after that. But first, we're just going to complete the questions from council. So go ahead, Councillor Braithwaite.
Thank you, Mayor. I have a couple of questions in regards to 6.2. The first one, and this I guess would go through the staff, is that I noticed that the current, it talks about the current project scope envisions an extensive public engagement process for the range of housing, and that range of housing is to include duplex, triplex, laneway, and detached secondary suites and heritage home conversions. And I'm wondering if townhouses might be able to be added to that list, because it seems to me that should be considered in there as well. So is that a possibility that at a motion from council, we could actually add townhouses into that, into the mix?
Anything's always possible, Councillor Braithwaite, but I'll just talk to if we reach out to Mr. Anderson in terms of whether that would substantially change the intention of the direction that we're heading here on the infill.
Thank you, Your Worship. No, I don't believe so, is the short answer. And to speak to the question, what staff would be doing is bringing forward what we're going to refer to as a project charter that would describe basically the overall approach and the content that would be included in this study. And so we'll bring that forward for council consideration. And yes, in this respect, we've been looking at the possibility of putting townhomes into the mix as well, and having a look at that as well. Thank you.
Mr. Anderson, is there any advantage to making some clarification at this point? I know that we're in the middle of a budget discussion here more than the specifics, but is there any advantage doing that here as opposed to at that point the charter comes forward?
Thank you, Worship. I don't believe so. I think the focus here is really, are we doing anything to advance this project in terms of timeline? And I think that's really that's sort of staffing and budget question that's before council.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead, Councillor Braithwaite.
Thank you. My second point was, and I'm not sure if I just missed this or if I just misinterpreted this, but I was read with interest in the package about the suggestion to rather than have separate housing types for the public engagement, to package them together. And I thought that packaging them together was what we were going to be doing from the beginning. So I'm not sure if I missed something there, or if that is an actual change, or if it was just something that I glossed over at some point.
Probably goes to speaking to having project charters earlier rather than later for that piece. Mr. Anderson.
Thank you, Your Worship. Yeah, the contemplation in terms of this project was to sort of take the individual housing types out separately to the community and have a full discussion and input on each of those. So what's being proposed to try and, I guess, reduce the timeline is preparing all the information associated with that range of housing types and taking that at one point in time through a process of public engagement with the community. So it really is kind of collapsing it into a package, and it does provide an opportunity to see the range. It might not provide as much an opportunity to have, I guess, a full discussion around each of the housing types and their merits and implications, but is a suggestion for us to consider in trying to, if we wanted to try and advance the completion of that particular study. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Anderson. Councillor Braithwaite.
Yeah, my last question is in regards to the village plan. I believe I heard Mr. Anderson talk about if we hired a consultant to take on that project, that we would lose the local knowledge and the knowledge about the community, and I appreciate that point. My question would be, if we wanted to complete the village area plan sooner, would it be possible to hire someone to perhaps take on the day-to-day workings from the public or from the building and planning department, and that would free up one of our staff members to concentrate on something like the village area plan, or is that not something that's feasible to do?
Mr. Anderson?
Yeah, as staff noted, it really for us to advance this and have something start off as early as July in order to meet an original timeline deadline, it's really not practical for us to try and add staff or try and augment staff. I should note that we're very shortly returning a new planner into our department, into our fold, and that with the addition of some other planning technical support, I think will make a big difference for us in terms of being able to move projects along. But in this one, again, as outlined in the memo, staff aren't recommending that we would add staff in order to advance the area plan project.
Okay, I guess maybe if I might, Mayor, with your indulgence, add just one other comment into that. And that is, I think I brought this up during our budget discussion about the possibility of separating the village area plans into doing, say, for example, Oak Bay Avenue first and then Cadbury Bay Road. And I know the answer that I got back then, and I'm wondering if that answer would still suffice for now.
Go ahead. Thank you, Councillor Braithwaite. Mr. Anderson.
Yeah, thank you, Your Worship. I'm actually struggling a little bit to remember the answer that was provided, but
I think it was something to do with, if you don't mind, Mayor, I think it was something to do with that it was better to holistically to see it all together.
Oh, okay. I thought I had given perhaps a little bit more detail on that, but I think part of the answer that I hope I would have provided would have been that sort of increasing the scope to include the corridors doesn't necessarily add a great deal to the timeline for a project. It involves certainly more work and principally more preparation work and expertise that's added by the consultants. But the corridor, like lopping off the corridor as part of the village area plan, I mean, it could reduce the time frame to a certain extent, but not to a significant extent would be the best answer to that one. Thank you, Your Worship.
Thank you, Mr. Anderson. I now have in my speaking list, Councillor Green, did you wish to speak, or your hand went up and then down, so I'm just checking.
Sorry, I think all of my questions have been answered, and I'll save my comments for later.
Okay. Thank you, Councillor Green. And I have Councillor Ney, and then I think we can go to the public. Go ahead, Councillor Ney.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you, Mayor, to Mr. Anderson. With respect to the suggestion or recommendation you're making for us to consider returning to recommendation 4 from the Climate Action Committee, I was just curious. I mean, I know all council has supported that, and recommendation 4, it makes a great deal of sense. But what I'm curious about from your perspective and expertise on this, that does it make sense given what we were looking at last council meeting regarding some of the initiatives that the province has underway regarding GHG requirements on new buildings, on the PACE program, as well as GHG requirements for existing buildings and building benchmarks to give local government the authority to implement those strategies. In light of those in motion, there's been no, confirmation of, they haven't materialized yet, but does it make sense for us as a local council to put energy into an initiative like that, with acknowledging that many of these larger initiatives are underway, at least as written, as we know through the mandate letters of the ministers, and for us to take action while those other those policy formations are underway. I'm just wondering if you could comment on that.
Sure. Thank you, Councillor Ney. Not to put you in too much of a spot here, Mr. Anderson, but do your best to answer that question if you could.
Thank you, Your Worship. I think Councillor Ney must have been reading my mind when that item had come before council previously, because what really did occur to me is that those initiatives are really ones that we would look at as part of development of programs associated with this. And you know, in terms of the timing of it, I would suggest that we'd want those to be moved and sort of having a chance of coming forward when we're developing our program. Because I think they would be a key part of Oak Bay and other regional municipalities programs around the reductions. So I think my short answer to that would be that, yeah, I think we should probably wait a little bit on the programs, because we would likely be looking to those provincial initiatives primarily to implement anything in Oak Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Anderson. Anything else, Councillor Ney? No, not seeing any. I don't see any other hands, so I'm going to go to the public. If there's any comments or questions from the public, we do ask people to pre-register. So the first member of the public that's registered for this section is Mr. Wilmot. Mr. Wilmot, you can leave your video off, but you can unmute yourself. And if you could just state your name and your municipality of resident for the record, then you are welcome to address council. Welcome, sir.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. I'd like to give the community perspective on item 6.2. I was quite surprised and concerned to read about this option. My understanding, there was a consensus already on how to proceed with this very, very contentious issue, that of legalizing secondary suites. What I thought we were going to do was have the consultant design a questionnaire that would be commented on by the council. The questionnaire would be filled in by the public. The advisory planning commission would look at all the relevant materials, make a recommendation to council, and proceed in this way. This initiative is a last-minute addition to a financial plan. It leaves no room for reasoned discussion by council, even less for the community. This isn't even a COW meeting, it's a council meeting. It expands greatly this discussion during a pandemic, trying to engage the public during a pandemic to cover a package of housing types. Wow. We have waited 10 years to deal with secondary suites. It's a very contentious issue. Let's go slowly, carefully, and get secondary suites right. I am baffled and perplexed by staff bringing these ideas forward in this manner at this date. I don't understand or appreciate, or maybe they don't appreciate, this community very well.
Mr. Wilmot, in respect, council has asked staff to bring back options for changing the timelines of the housing framework discussion. And just as part of a respectful workplace here, I just ask you not to question the merits or motivations of the staff in this. We've asked for options to come forward, and this is the report coming forward to give us some options. So that's
am I allowed to comment on the fact that the staff might not know this community very well? Is that a reasonable statement to make? In my opinion, that's what I think. They don't understand this community.
Well, it's our job as a council to provide that community input, but you just try and keep your comments on the point of process.
All I can say is we've worked on getting secondary suites legalized for 10 years in this community. I think one has to do it slowly, carefully, bring the community along, which can be done, and get it right. At this stage, whatever the merits of this are on paper in this community, and I think this is not a good idea to proceed in this direction at this particular time. If knowing the community, that's what I would suggest, that council reject this. Some of the parts might be good, but it is not the right thing to do at this right time if you want to deal with a very contentious issue and try to get consensus in the community. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wilmot. I think it's worth just clarifying for the public a little bit to separate out the housing framework discussion, which is looking at the broader suite of potential housing options, from a secondary suite process, which is following a slightly more advanced process because it was started earlier. Mr. Anderson, could you maybe just clarify? There's a secondary suites process, which is following its own piece, and then this is the discussion around other housing forms outside of suites. Perhaps you can just clarify that those two different processes underway.
Yes, Your Worship, thank you. As you know, the secondary suites is an initiative that is already underway and is proceeding now to have the public comment on a draft strategy associated with secondary suites. As part of the overall housing framework, we also had direction and have budgeted and have proceeded to prepare for an infill housing study. That's something that would be coming forward to council and would be initiated, as we noted earlier, and intend to be completed by the first quarter of 2022 if council so directs. The third component that is before us this evening is also contemplated as part of a priority initiative that council has directed, and the village area plans would be looking at broader planning issues for example, for the Oak Bay Village area, but also looking at the multifamily residential housing opportunities that might be there in that village. So they're separate initiatives. We've already have budget in place that council has provided for those initiatives. The secondary suites is advancing as it was initiated earlier and prior to the other two initiatives. Thank you, Your Worship.
Thank you, Mr. Anderson. I think it's important to kind of clarify that. I know it gets a bit muddled at times as to which of the pieces we're talking about, but I think as long as we're staying clear. Are there any other members of the public, Ms. Williams, who have called in or have raised their hands in this meeting?
Nobody at this time, Your Worship.
Okay, thank you very much for that. So we have, I have nobody else on the speak. Oh, I have Councillor Zelka raising his hands. Go ahead, Councillor Zelka.
Thank you very much, Chair. Can I just clarify something maybe through you with staff? These sort of initiatives, plus all the initiatives that are currently in process, and if I remember correctly, like with respect to the climate action aspects, I understand the Energy Step program aspects are in process. If I understand correctly, possibly some of the Cool Kit aspects might be on our list of priorities and maybe either being delayed or possibly in process. I understand there's some work also being done on active transportation that we'll hear about shortly that are related to the climate action work group and the excellent work they've done, plus maybe some other ones that are in process. But so with respect to all of this work that's happening, if I understand correctly, if I remember correctly, all of this can only fit in within that 10% at most of staff time to be allocated to these additional council priorities, I think we're calling them. You know, the 90% of staff work is just to keep, you know, the lights on, keep the garbage collected, keep the water flowing, and the sewage moving along its way. So with only, I just want to confirm, it is only 10% of their time could be allocated to these sorts of projects. That's question number one.
Sure, and I think this is probably an appropriate question for either Mr. Payne or Ms. Varela, that speaks to a broader consideration of staffing and costs
and workload.
Ms. Varela, are you available to try and address Councillor Zelka's comments? If not, then maybe just ask Mr. Payne.
Absolutely, Your Worship. Thank you for that opportunity. The 90-10 rule, or the 80-20, has sort of been a long-standing analogy, I guess, used by local governments to talk about the lion's share of staff work is actually, as Councillor Zelka referred to, those providing service. Council can provide instruction through the year to add on those special initiatives. And then the other type of work that we also get added to is council resolutions that are provided during the year. So the Director of Strategic Initiatives was starting to move us away from that 80-20 or 90-10 rule, because it really, it's about the different types of work. We know service provision is the largest. Certainly, as we have demonstrated a more refined strategic planning approach, Council maintains its commitment that if things are added, we look at the impacts on workload and budget. Council can provide instruction during the year, and then we can let you know what it would take to have that happen. So right now, based on the most recent presentation by the Director of Strategic Initiatives, I think Council should have a pretty good understanding of where the work plans are shaking out. And I think Council is just finalizing its commitment to funding. So I hope that answered the question, Councillor Zelka.
If I may, thank you. It very much did, and I thank you so much for reminding me of how this fits into the whole. I mean, and I do want to thank staff for helping us gently, but sometimes firmly with how do I say managing our expectations. I certainly when I was a first-term councillor, I did get a bit frustrated at what I refer to as the speed of government. But there's really only so many initiatives that we can shove down the pike and then try and whip staff to get her done. And if I just wanted to highlight, and maybe for the public as well, if we pile too many of these initiatives on, our only choice is to raise taxes, hire more people, and we may not want to do that. So that's where the balance comes in terms of this table. When I read this report, as I know we asked for it, but it scared the heck out of me when I saw some of those numbers coming back. So I just wanted to sort of share with my colleagues and maybe with the public. I would hope that we would maybe just slow down a teeny bit and give staff maybe a chance to catch up to some of these initiatives that we're trying to move forward in an expedited way that we may not be able to do, especially during a pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Zelka. I have Councillor Appleton next.
Thank you, Your Worship. So if I understand this, the procedure correctly, and staff will correct me if I'm wrong, that any amendments that would to the financial plan arising from this memo would be by motion, correct?
That is correct, yes.
Then I would like to make a motion with respect to the Community Climate Action Working Group item, if I may.
You may.
I would like to make a motion that, as per the staff estimate, that $20,000 be added to the 2021 to 2025 financial plan to provide for consultant resources to advance Community Climate Action Working Group recommendation number 4.
Thank you, Councillor Appleton. Is there a seconder for that motion?
I'll second that.
Seconded by Councillor Zelka. Councillor Appleton, do you want to speak to that? And then I might just get some guidance from staff in terms of making sure we're following an appropriate process here.
Thank you, Your Worship, and I'll be brief. As Council is already aware, this is a recommendation of the Community Climate Action Work Group, one of their top 5 recommendations. I do hear the comments from Councillor Ney and agree that senior level initiatives on this topic are underway. So I think that including this component should take those things into effect. Respectfully, I believe that it's time to get underway with this item, so it is time to start. Council will also recall that we have already approved and provided for resources in the budget to provide for a community level grant program to assist with things like energy retrofits that could support the community in doing this type of work. I see this work to action, this recommendation, to be sort of the glue between those two items. Certainly there will be a senior level initiative going on. We have funds already allocated in the budget to provide for retrofits and to provide support to the community to do this work. Now we need the infrastructure and the framework in which to do that. That, in my opinion, is what this is.
Thank you, Councillor Appleton. Before I go further, I just want to turn to staff to make sure that procedurally we're okay here in terms of the process underway by this resolution. And perhaps also the clarification, this is $20,000 as I read it, so make sure I'm reading that correctly, and where that $20,000 would be sequestered from to accomplish this. And perhaps if there's any comments, additional comments about impacts on staff. So perhaps Mr. Payne, can we just, from your perspective, does that motion that's been made and seconded meet the requirements to give clarity of direction on this item?
Yes, Your Worship. From a financial planning document preparation perspective, it makes perfect sense to me. It's clear. Absent of any additional council a direction, we would fund that using our accumulated surplus reserve. However, council may consider wanting to fund that out of a climate action reserve, but staff won't make that presumption without that direction being given. So I'm just adding that extra insight.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Payne. That might be helpful if we gave that some of that clarification. It's not necessary, though. We could leave that for a future discussion as well. If council is willing to do so, just let staff make that determination. Any other discussion? I see Councillor Zelka, you seconded it, and then I'll go to Councillor Ney.
Oh, thank you very much, Chair. A question through you. Let me start with the chair, the liaison to the community, to the Climate Action Review Committee. There was a recommendation 3 of that committee, which did speak of providing rebates for actions that reduce greenhouse gases that could include heating systems, electric garden equipment, and e-bikes. Whereas recommendation 4 talks about 2 separate programs that also potentially may include rebates in addition for existing houses. And for new houses would be, for example, possible changes to the energy SEP code, for example. I was wondering if I may, Chair, ask through to Councillor Appleton if he could help me understand or tease apart recommendation 3 and recommendation 4.
Before I go to Councillor Appleton, Councillor Zelk, I'm just going to go to Mr. Anderson because it'd be helpful, I think, for us to understand the staff's understanding of that differential, because they'd ultimately be the ones looking to implement this if this motion passes. Mr. Anderson, do you have a clear sense of the differential between there is a bit of verbal overlap between those 2 aspects, the differences between resolution, the recommendation 3, which was already been passed under priorities, and then recommendation 4, which is here in front of us now.
Yes, thank you, Your Worship. My understanding is that recommendation 3, while it is grants and rebates that are being looked at, it's not related to housing, and that's, in my understanding, why recommendation 4 specifically speaks to energy reductions around new and existing buildings and in housing. So I think there is a distinction. There is as Councillor Appleton noted, a program that's going to be developed for recommendation 3 associated with energy reduction. But my understanding is it wouldn't be focused on buildings and housing. And I stand to be corrected. Thank you, Your Worship.
I'll let Councillor Appleton jump in if he wishes, but if not, I will. Go ahead, Councillor Appleton.
Thank you, Your Worship. I think that and I think it's a reasonable question. I think that part of what is at issue here is that we have assigned, council collectively have assigned that recommendation 3 for community level grants, but have not as a collective body had a discussion about what that granting program should look like. With COVID restrictions and with workload implications, we have not collectively had that decision. I think that the climate action work group visualized those grants being used for a wide range of community level initiatives. Whether or not they could be used for building retrofits, I think would be the assignment of those funds and how they would be dispersed and on what types of things. I would see that as a discussion for council to have. We haven't yet had that discussion, but clearly other communities are providing top-ups for retrofits for buildings. We know this is the case. So given the fact that we've not made a decision about how those grants would be dispersed, I don't think that I'm overstepping to say that the members of the Climate Action Work Group, I think would probably be in general support of having at least a portion of those funds being used as a top up for existing CRD and senior level government energy rebates for houses.
Thank you, Councillor Appleton. Councillor Ney. Sorry, Councillor Zelka, keep going. You have the floor still.
Sorry, the last follow-up, if I may. Thank you so much. And thank you so much, Councillor Appleton, and staff as well for clarifying step 3, step 4 aspects of those recommendations. The province is helping right now in this area. I mean, Victoria and Saanich have a program like this already in place, but some who have emailed me have indicated that we don't. So with respect to recommendation number 4, highly recommend all those listening go to abetterhomesbc.ca and find out the doubled rebates available today until March 31st, 2021, when they go back to the normal levels. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Zelka. Councillor Nay.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So while I fully support the recommendation number 4 to accelerate GHG reductions and retrofitting and adapting existing homes, my understanding is that the most effective strategies for realizing those goals are the strategies that the provincial government is currently working on, for which local governments have no authority to implement. And because the policy work is currently underway with the province, and we don't know the rollout of this, we don't know how close they are to rolling those policies out. I think it's a bit premature right now to be funding this particular recommendation without those other policy levers in place by the provincial government. So I'm not going to be voting in support of this motion, unfortunately, at this time.
Thank you, Councillor Nay. I'm just wondering if there's any path here that would allow for supporting of this motion to move forward, but time the actioning of it, the hiring of the consultant, to when the province has been a bit more clear about what projects they have coming down the pike, and that would then allow us to not have to wait till the next budget cycle to approve it, but we could step up at the moment that becomes that direction is clear. We can then start our own internal process to dovetail to that. But I'm not sure from a wording perspective, A, if the mover would be interested in that, and B, what wording would be required to give that sort of direction. So before I go to any kind of wording discussion, and always just in the interest of seeking compromise here, Councillor Appleton, is that something you'd be amenable to? Would you prefer to start this now and then adapt that later when that direction is more clear?
I guess I would be amenable to a point. I have strong concerns about what the timeline will look like on this. This is frankly a climate emergency. So given the fact that it's nebulous, if I could be assured that that type of material would be available to us, say within a 4 to 6 month time frame, then I would probably be amenable to that. Given the fact that I do not know when that is happening, then I probably, then I don't think that I would be. Frankly, these are I will remind council, the recommendations that were requested by council of the Climate Action Work Group were intended to be things that were actionable in the short term. And if the information provided by the consultant under this item allowed us to be able to design a program that allowed us to use already approved grant funds so that people could take advantage of the rebates which are already in place, as Councillor Zelka has mentioned. If we have the ability to roll out and be able to disperse those funds in this year to make a difference for people who want to buy a heat pump, or to make a difference to people who want to make those kinds of upgrades, we can do that this year. We can do that, very, very quickly, or we can choose to defer. So my take on this is that we have the ability through this item to design a program to allow people to make a difference in 2021. That is something that is doable. I don't debate the rationale for trying to dovetail with a provincial program. However, we have funds available already to disperse to the community, and I would like to see us do it. So in the absence of a firm timeline to receive that kind of information from the province, I'm not amenable to deferring it.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Appleton. I just want to keep people's expectations reasonable on this. If this gets approved and move forward immediately, that will come back with a report on options to implement, and that will then, of course, still have to be dealt with the ability of us to implement those with staff time, et cetera. So I don't want to set the expectation if we do this, it's automatically done in a short order, but I appreciate the comments made there. I have Councillor Ney, you still had the floor. Did you have anything else to add?
No, I mean, my understanding is that these grants are currently available for the community to access as is. So I don't think it's an efficient use of staff time to start working. I don't think there's enough bang for buck. Okay, so that's all I have to say.
Thank you, Councillor Ney. Councillor Braithwaite.
Thank you, Mayor. Yeah, I would actually agree with Councillor Ney. I appreciate this coming forward, and I think it's important for us to support it, but I would like to see, and I'm assuming that the timeline is going to be short for what's going to come down from above. And so at this point, I agree that it's not something that I would like staff time and energy spent on if something different is going to come down the wire. So I think for me, I would also vote not to move forward on this at this time, but I would like to move forward on it eventually.
Thanks, Councillor Braithwaite. I have Councillor Green. And then.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mayor. And I would, and I agree, I think, with my colleagues, Councillors Braithwaite and Ney, that if the province is going to play a more significant role in this very important work, and I agree with Councillor Appleton, we are in a climate emergency, then I would support allowing the province to, put their cards on the table first. I actually think, and I agree, given this report and on every page, it captures the fact that it captures the fact that wasn't my child, by the way. That it captures the fact that we have so many priorities before us and in front of us, and the big ones that have the greatest impact on our community, as well as climate change, of course, are infrastructure and housing. So I think if the province is going to be stepping up, then yes, let's push on this item. But I would hate to waste staff's time right now. And I don't mean that it's a waste, but that staff have enough pressure on other priorities and other commitments where there is quite a few community expectations. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Green. I don't see any other hands up at this point. So the motion is on the floor, Councillor Appleton, to move forward with this initiative in this year, in this budget. So that's the sitting in front of us. Any other comments? I'm not seeing any. I'll just add my 2 cents on this. I'm actually quite torn on this because I think it deserves to be moved forward and to allow us to be opportunistic. I think having it in this year's budget, given especially that it's just essentially assigning money from a reserve, and I would suggest we take it from the Climate Action Reserve. I think it's a good use of this kind of money, and it has minimal impact on staff when it's done. All pointed to saying yes. I do have concerns that a lot of the initiatives that are out there, and I think for $20,000, you essentially get a survey of what other jurisdictions are doing and come back with a checklist of options, might be much better optimized given what the province has certainly stated publicly they're intending to do. So I wouldn't want to spend that money and then have to turn around in 8 months' time and have to do it all again. So I'm actually not entirely clear on how to support this because it's the motion is the right one. The timing is the question mark, and so I'd hate to vote it down and not have that money at hand. Maybe I'll just put that as a question to Mr. Payne, I guess. Procedurally, if this was defeated, I guess anything can always be brought back, but this could be brought back given we're talking about pulling money from reserves at any point in this year if it's seen to be opportunistic. Is that correct?
Yes, Your Worship, there should be enough flexibility in their special projects budget so that if it needed to come forward, we would have an opportunity to fund it.
Okay. Okay, thank you. I think I'm still probably leaning towards supporting the motion as it stands, because I think it's better to have it in the budget now and have that clarity. But I think I totally understand where the other people's comments are coming from. I have Councillor Zelka and then Councillor Green. Sorry to reopen the debate a little bit. I just had to say my 2 cents of where I was struggling with this particular motion. Go ahead, Councillor Zelka.
Thank you so much, Chair, and I appreciate the struggle. I'm treating, well, first of all, something is better than nothing, which is, everyone has to do a little bit, and this is an area we actually have some control over. So that's one of the reasons I'm supporting it. And number 2 is I'm treating this like a shovel-ready project. We know there's some changes that are going to be coming down, but we also know there's some things we can do today. So by having something in place, just like what we do with our grant applications, we try to have shovel-ready projects ready to go so that when that program's there, we can jump in there and be first in line. If we don't approve this now, I don't think we'll be first in line. That's what I worry about. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Zelka. I have Councillor Green. Did you have your hand up again? No. Okay. Thank you. Oh, Councillor Ney. There we go.
One more point, Mr. Mayor. Can I just get some clarity through you to staff, I suppose? If this motion were to go forward, does that preclude us considering any of these other possibilities in this staff report before us currently?
It does not, I think, is the short answer.
Okay, thank you.
We're just dealing with the motion that's on the floor at the moment. It's not seeing any other comments. So, oh, go ahead, Councillor Patterson.
Thank you, Mayor. It's been quite an interesting discussion. I'm really torn here because I think the motion really has merit, and I recognize that we are in a climate emergency and the importance of this. But it is in a report that pushes back the timing on so many other projects. It's difficult. I think, though, I would be interested in, because the initial report that's going to come back, we're going to be engaging a consultant. I certainly appreciate, though, what Councillor Ney, the references made to the province, I believe, is very close to bringing forward programs that they're going to roll out. And it's difficult not knowing how this will work in coordination with those, but the money is in the budget. I would think that it could come out. There is a climate action reserve fund that is there. The ask for this is not sizable, although it may lead to expectations in the community that there's going to be an immediate rollout, and I don't know that will be the case, but it would be I think it would be useful to have the consulting report to indicate to us what actions we could take as a community to tie in with government programs that are available. And I think it would, there's a lot of interest in our community about dealing with the climate emergency. So this is a relatively small ask to serve that purpose. So I believe I will lean in favor of the motion as it is presented, although somewhat hesitantly with everything else on the plate.
Thank you, Councillor Patterson. I don't know, Councillor Ney, you have your hand up still. Do you wish to speak? No, it's just it's a sticky hand. Got it. Councillor Appleton, you can go ahead for a second time.
Thank you, Your Worship. I'll be brief, and I appreciate the other councillors' comments on this. Ultimately, we as a council have to decide whether or not we are going to actually allocate resources to addressing the climate emergency. We have passed resolutions in order to assign budget to other recommendations of the Climate Action Work Group and have not been able to roll them out for various reasons with various delays. Frankly, if we cannot see our way clear to committing a relatively modest amount of funds so that we can be ready to act on senior government programs when they become available, I'm not sure how we can really be putting ourselves forward as actioning those recommendations and actioning what the community has told us through the Climate Action Work Group.
Thanks, Councillor Appleton. Councillor Braithwaite.
Thank you, Mayor. I don't think, in all due respect, that's not what I'm saying by voting against this motion. What I'm saying by voting against this motion is that, although I do support everything that that you've talked about, I worry about how this.
I'm just going to ask everybody to address their comments through me, not
Sorry.
any other. It's okay.
I just worry about what this takes away from our other current priorities that we have on our actual council priorities list right now. So that's the only thing. I mean, I know that it sounds like this motion is going to go through, and I'm happy about that. I just think that it's important that that we also, in respect to what else we have on the plate right now, that we take that into account as well.
Thank you, Councillor Braithwaite. Councillor Green, you had your hand up.
Yes, thank you. And through you, Mayor, I would also echo Councillor Braithwaite's comments. My comments are related to the other community expectations. We have so many community expectations raised now. And I agree with Councillor Appleton. We have to make some kind of stand or take some kind of stand on climate action and climate emergency. But I also think this is another area where the province tends to devolve the responsibility, and really we need that kind of support at the local level. We can't do it all. I mean, Oak Bay's infrastructure, for instance, cannot handle climate emergency now. I mean, we're having flooding issues, we're having stormwater issues. So I really think this is a shared responsibility and between two governments. And I really would like to see a plan from the province before I committed staff time and more money to something local without a clear plan. But I support it in principle, absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Green. I think we've had enough discussion on this item. So we have a motion. Councillor Patterson, did you wish to speak again, or are you?
Just, I guess it's certainly, this is a very useful discussion. The way I see this is the very small ask on this. We would be using an external consultant to at least bring the report forward. We don't know at this point in time what the recommendations will be out of that report. And we may, depending on what comes forward, we may find that we don't have the staff time to allocate to it. But I think that it would be, in my opinion at least, beneficial to have the knowledge of what it is I'm going to be turning down before I just step aside from it. And I think it's very important to members of the community, as all issues are, and this will give us a clearer understanding of potentially what we could do. And although understandably, or any rollout might be pushed a bit further down the road, depending on other needs for staff time for important projects also. So I still favor supporting it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Patterson. Not seeing any other discussion. The motion on the table is to approve this $20,000 for a consultant for this in this budget year. I don't see any other. I see a hand up, but I think Councillor Green, it's remaining up there from before, so I'll leave that. And I'm going to call the question. All those in favor of the motion, if I can get clear hands. And to Councillor Zelka, Patterson, Appleton, I see hands, and those opposed. Councillor Green, nay, and Braithwaite. I will vote in favor of this as the casting vote, so that passes by 4-3. I think I think we all understand the concerns here of moving as quickly as possible, but also paying close attention to that the province is doing. So perhaps we can just ask of staff as that moves forward that the consultant is tasked with doing everything they can to understand what the province's goals are as well, and trying to include that as part of the recommendations and options coming back. Councillor Patterson.
Just in addition, if I might, Mr. Mayor, that I think it was agreed that the funding would be paid from the Climate Action Reserve Fund.
I don't think we've got that specific. It wasn't in the motion. I think that's a reasonable place for it to come from, but perhaps, Mr. Payne, does that decision need to be made here, or should?
Your worship, the decision should be made before I bring the financial plan for bylaw adoption. So tonight is a good night. As mentioned, staff don't want to be presumptuous on the use of those reserve funds. So that's why we would ask for specificity there.
So why don't you make a simple motion, Councillor Patterson, one way or the other, where you want it to come from? I think the two options suggested by staff were the accumulated surplus or the climate action reserve, one of those two, and we'll just have a debate quickly and vote on that.
I would then make a motion that the $20,000 consulting budget for the Climate Action Work Group recommendation number 4 be allocated from the Climate Action Reserve Fund in the 2021 budget.
Is that a seconder, Councillor Appleton? Moved and seconded. Any other discussion on that item? Not seeing it, I'll call the question. All those in favor? Any opposed? Councillor Green opposed? That passes. So that money will come out of that fund. So thank you for that. And that's to me, in my mind, a very logical place for that to come out of, as it's the accumulated surplus that we've used for doing our internal improvements. All right. And are there any other motions arising from this section? Councillor Ney.
To make an motion that we ask staff to pursue the infill housing project to be completed closer to the original timeline by modifying the scope of the project.
Moved to see a seconder of that. Okay, thank you. Do you wish to motivate on that, Councillor Ney? Or
no, I think it's just kind of, I'll just say is that housing's in a crisis. I just think it needs to be done now, not later. And by reducing the scope of the project, we're not losing anything but keeping things on track as we originally planned.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Ney. Councillor Braithwaite.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm just wondering, as to my comments before about townhouses, if we need to actually include that in there, or if staff has the understanding that townhouses would be included.
What I heard from Mr. Anderson was that they would be included as part of the project charter that's coming back as an option. Mr. Anderson, is that a fair comment?
Yes, Your Worship. Thank you.
Okay, so I think that he's heard that, and that will come back as an option for us to include. So not part of the budget. Thank you, Councillor Braithwaite. Councillor Appleton.
Thank you, Your Worship. I understand the interest in efficiencies and speeding things up. I absolutely concur. I guess what I would, and maybe this is a question through you to staff, but I have concerns because as council will recall, the last time the infill discussion went out to the public, that it was potentially more contentious than it needed to be because all of the proposed options were essentially in front of the public at once. And having attended some of those sessions, I think part of the issue there is that the community tended to gravitate towards those options which were the densest and potentially the most at issue. And the discussion about the lower density or duplex and triplex options tended to get lost. So structurally, although logically I understand the motivation, structurally, maybe staff can comment on that, because I saw that the process essentially went sideways a little bit last time because there was a lot of emphasis being put by attendees on the densest, largest possible option.
Thank you, Councillor Appleton. Mr. Anderson, any comments on that? my memories are different than that, Councillor Appleton, I'll say that. But go ahead, Mr. Anderson, if you have any comments.
Well, as I think council's aware, I wasn't with the district at the time that the infill project was brought forward previously. I think in terms of this, I guess, alternative, it was presented as a way to try and shorten that process somewhat, and that's really the spirit that it's provided to council. I think the original contemplation of this was to provide a little bit more opportunity to look at each of the different housing options for neighborhoods and allow for, I guess, some individual or separate consideration of same. And that was the original contemplation, and it is still, if council doesn't direct this to be modified. I think the other comment I want to make is that this is really at the lower end of the density spectrum in terms of housing. Town housing being added is a little bit further up the spectrum, but we're still into the, if you will, the low rise range of housing types. So I'm not sure what was brought forward, frankly, in the previous, if in fact something beyond that in terms of density and scale was presented. But I think we're within the lower range with this this project. Thank you, Worship.
Thank you, Mr. Anderson. Anything else, Councillor Appleton? You're signed off. Okay, no. Anything else? No. Yeah, go ahead, Councillor Appleton. You have the floor still.
Well, I just wanted to say I concur that I would concur with Mr. Anderson that what is being proposed are lower density options. I just recall, I wouldn't debate that. I just recall that the discussion that I attended when there was a public meeting about housing options was that the opinion varied pretty widely between what we would describe as lower density options. So some people who would potentially be in support of a duplex, triplex might think that something that was comparatively only slightly more dense was out of scale. So, and I'm not saying that would necessarily repeat itself, but that was what I encountered when I attended that meeting. So,
thank you, Councillor Appleton. Did I see another hand up on this? Councillor Zelka.
Thank you very much, Chair. I heard one of my council colleagues talk about how there's a housing crisis going on right now. Unfortunately, the numbers don't agree with that. The pandemic is causing all sorts of upheaval across Canada. The rental rates, the rental, how do I say this? Occupancy. It's been described as softening. In the Victoria area, it's described as only 90% plus occupancy, somewhere in the range of just under 10% vacancy, which is absolutely unheard of. But of course, without any of the students and without any of with all the vacation rental properties essentially vacant, there is a lot of space out there available for rent. So if we're going to do this, we're not doing it for this year. And we may not even be doing it for next year. We'll be doing it for, hopefully when things get back to normal, although we really have a new normal to consider since most people are now leaving the big cities and now working from, smaller centers. Some of the assumptions that we've had may no longer apply. I just want us to maybe go back and at this time, especially when we get back to normal, we're gonna have to redo our homework and get a better feel for what these markets are doing. Because right now there is no demand for increase of density. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Zelka. I don't see any other hands. The motion's on the floor. I'm going to I'll speak here in favor of the motion. I believe actually without the timeline changes, I actually fundamentally believe we are better off having a wholesome discussion. To Councillor Zelka's point, we have to look at our actual housing needs, what we want to provide, and different housing forms provide different options and different benefits and issues. And I think if we have the discussion as a whole, I grant we may not be able to delve as deep into individual public sessions, But I think the broader question, the policy question that we're going to be dealing with as a council benefits from that shared discussion about all the possible housing options, what the pros and cons are, and then making decisions in that context, not just one by one, because I think the whole is quite different than the parts, and I think it'll benefit from that. And to Councillor Appleton's point, it does have to be managed very well. I think that's going to be our task, is to make sure that we're framing that conversation well. So I'm quite happy to support the motion. I think it will actually benefit the conversation in the long run. Councillor Green, your hand is up. Did you wish to speak?
Yes, thank you, Mayor. Yeah, I just wanted to add my voice to supporting the motion. And the reason I'm supporting the motion is that not only are we managing expectations around things like climate change, we have a huge expectation in this community that we will get housing, and that we will get housing right, that we will finally deal with some of the housing issues that have been lingering in Oak Bay for many, many years. And to Councillor Zelka's comments on the housing market, I'm actually hearing the opposite. So I don't know which is correct, but I do know that certain groups are being hit hard in this current market. Groups like single parent families and people of lower income. So it may be a great market for some people, but I think the majority are suffering. And so anyway, I will support this motion because I think we should move ahead and try to expedite this this project. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Green. I don't see any other hands up on this. So I'll call the question. This is the motion to move forward with the shared approach to community consultation on the housing options, to move the timeline forward by about a quarter, hopefully. All those in favor? Any opposed? Councillor Zelka opposed. That motion passes. Are there any other motions arising from this report? All right, so we'll move forward with that. And as we move forward, I hope we can just continue to get updates on those other pieces that are in the queue, and perhaps we can lay some groundwork if things are moving forward as they go. That would appear to end our council priority initiatives for infill housing and village area plans. We did make a call for public input. We've had one. I'm happy to take, I guess, no, really, we've concluded our motions on this item, so we'll move forward at this point. Unless anybody else has anything else to raise. Not seeing any, so I'll move on to item number 6.3. I think this will go, we'll be moving through some of these a little faster than the last ones. I'm assuming, Mr. Payne, you're presenting this piece again, and again, we'll invite members of the public to speak to this after council's had a chance to ask questions. Welcome back, Mr. Payne.
Thank you, Your Worship. Just going to put up a brief presentation that staff have prepared to assist with some of the discussion around infrastructure funding that we've been having over a number of weeks. Certainly not intended to be a complete picture or complete presentation about asset management, but certainly some additional context to assist with decision making. So staff contend that asset management progress can be measured or looked at in three different ways, basically. How well are we planning for our asset replacement? How well are we funding our asset replacement? And how well are we replacing those assets? We've largely been focusing on how well are we funding the middle piece here during the last three budget discussions, but there is additional context that council and the public should be aware of when making these decisions. In terms of how well we are planning, you be the judge, but we've got a number, several master plans that are underway or have been completed or anticipated to be completed within the first 2 or 3 years of this financial plan. So here's just some of the examples for a road and our water and sewer storm. We've completed an Opus asset management report. We've completed our water master plan light. We've got a sanitary sewer master plan underway and a storm sewer master plan scheduled thereafter. For facilities, we've got a facilities master plan that's expected to start this year and continue into 2022. All in all, once all of the master plans are complete, we'll have a very thorough opportunity to prepare some very robust capital program planning. You know, council has had the opportunity to see capital program budgets, but maybe not the details of what that program means. And so these master plans certainly flesh out those program components. As mentioned, we've discussed a lot what we're calling sustainable infrastructure funding. What really does that mean? You know, and annual funding ideally should equal the cost of the asset divided by the life of the asset. So if we have an asset worth $1 million that will last 10 years, we should set aside $100,000 every year from the very beginning, from year zero. Right? So if we set aside this amount, we'll have the full cost of that asset in our reserve when we need to replace that asset. That's the idea between sustainable funding. So we call that sustainable infrastructure funding. But if it's not implemented from day one, which is often the case in BC municipalities and across Canada, it creates what I call a cumulative infrastructure funding deficit. I'm going to demonstrate what I mean by that. So we may be on our way to achieving sustainable infrastructure funding, and we've highlighted that fact many times in the financial plan. But that doesn't mean that we've solved our cumulative infrastructure funding deficit, which we will show in the infrastructure replacement plan that we have accumulated. So just a visual example of this. Suppose, for instance, that we purchase a number of assets. In this case, I modeled some stormwater purchases. So as we are purchasing and building stormwater capital, suppose that council implement sustainable funding immediately. This is how our funding level would rise over the first 10, 20 years or so. And then once we get to that top green line, we've achieved sustainable funding. That's the ideal funding levels that should be implemented, but it's often not. Usually what happens is communities start realizing that they should be saving money for those assets far along in the asset's useful life. So in this case, let's say a council decided after 40 years of installing those stormwater assets, oh gee, we should really be increasing our sustainable infrastructure levels. So we start to increase our sustainable infrastructure levels at year 40. We achieve sustainable funding at year 60. But in the meantime, after 40 years has passed, we've accumulated a deficit of funding that we didn't save, that we should have saved all along under ideal conditions. And you know, this is a fabricated example here, but this is almost exactly what has happened with our fire replacement reserve. So we've only set aside a fraction of what the annual funding has been for a number of years. Last year, we increased that to sustainable funding levels, but it doesn't address the backlog of cumulative funding that we haven't saved. And that's why the fire equipment replacement reserve is forecasted to go negative, and why there would be a requirement to borrow from other reserves or fund in a different way. So this is a visual example of what happens to your reserve balances over the life cycle of that asset. Again, I'm using a stormwater capital as an example here. Supposing that from year one, we implemented sustainable infrastructure funding, you see how our reserve balance grows over the life of that asset. And then when we begin to replace those assets at year 80 and thereafter, the reserve balance goes down. That's the natural cycle of a reserve balance. But if we didn't start putting money away in that reserve until year 40, our reserves haven't grown large enough to sustain all of the replacements that come due after year 80, and our reserves go negative. So although after year 40, we achieve sustainable funding, it doesn't address the money that we should have had in the reserve. So that's what's meant when we talk about sustainable funding level here. It's really the first and foundational piece that council should be looking at, but a strategy to address the deferred maintenance and the cost of that, that's really a phase 2 thing that council needs to consider, that staff would like to provide information to assist with that. So how well are we replacing assets? The district has increased its capital replacement output significantly over the past 5 years, but council and the public may want a chance to decide, is it significant enough? And we need to put that in context. We need to be able to put that in context to decide that. So output information and other measures in its asset management strategy are expected in Q2 and the infrastructure replacement plan. So for instance, we can tell you how much linear meters of stormwater is being replaced for this budget, and put that in context of the entire system. That's important information for council to understand. We'll also provide weighted average age of asset class and the proportion of assets beyond its recommended useful life. That's your infrastructure deficit information, condition assessments on all of our assets. Those will all appear in the infrastructure replacement plan. So in summary, rapid progress is being made, especially if you compare to just a couple of years ago, how the budget looked and the additional information that's in the budget right now and how it is linked to a longer term focus, and how well council has made progress on the sustainable funding progress. Output has increased significantly. And again, when you just compare that to output in previous years, the actual rate of assets being replaced is significant. But again, you're welcome to hold opinion that that's not significant enough and more needs to be done. And you're able to make that determination with more information. Master plans are underway, and I'll just note that council's committed over $750,000 in asset management plans in the from 2020 onward. So that's significant. And hopefully we'll have an infrastructure replacement plan this fall, time permitting, and an asset management strategy update in Q2. So this is the long game. You know, there's no magic bullet. There's no funding that you could approve this year to solve decades of infrastructure deficit. Where are we leading? What I'll say is that, again, I repeat, most Canadian municipalities are facing this issue, high proportion of Canadians, and very few have made such rapid progress as Oak Bay have made. In fact, there's still growing municipalities that are mistakenly not investing in sustainable funding because they're not feeling the financial pressure of their assets, because they don't need to be replaced right now. They need to be replaced 50 years from now. And when they need to be replaced and they hear from their citizens about that, that's when they'll feel that pressure, and they'll most likely regret not having invested in sustainable funding previously. I just use Ontario as an example. Ontario has legislated that asset management plans be in place, long-term asset management plans. And so the fact that we don't have that in Oak Bay, we would be breaking the law if Oak Bay was in Ontario. I think it's an essential requirement, which is why staff under council's direction are leading the way there. So, Your Worship, that concludes the brief asset management progress or funding progress presentation. We can pause here, or we can continue right on into the capital budget as you wish.
I'll allow if council has questions at this point, or we can, and then I'll ask for, we can, if there's no questions right now, we'll just go to questions after the capital budget presentation portion. Okay, looks like we can move on, and I'll take public questions after 6.4 as well then. Go ahead, Mr. Payne.
Thank you, Your Worship. I'm just going to pull up the capital budgets, and Your Worship, unless you have any objection, we would actually like to begin with the Parks, Rec and Culture budget, and then we'll work our way backwards through to the Engineering and Public Works budgets.
Yes, we've certainly gone through all of these already for the most part. So how level of detail are you looking at going into these budget pieces? I'm just cognizant it's 9:32 right now, and we want to get through these pieces and allow for time for discussion as well. So,
Your Worship, I'll take direction from the chair if you want a more succinct presentation. The items we were going to focus on are just basically new or changes. But if council's reviewed the capital budget, we're welcome to take questions now. And
no, I think it's worth just highlighting those changes for the benefit of the public and for council. I don't want to skip that part. I just didn't want to go reiterate what we've talked about previously. So thank you.
Yes, thank you, Your Worship. Great. So starting on page 109. Recall previously, I believe at the end of 2020, council adopted a department budget transfer policy. However, council expressed some desire to permit budget transfers within programs as opposed to budget transfers amongst capital projects. So what we've done, we've listened to your feedback. And we've organized the Parks, Rec, and Culture budget into 4 main program areas that can be discussed like that. And the 4 main programs are your facilities program, your vehicles and equipment replacement, your parks and playground, and your public art. So the first program area that we're discussing here is the facilities program. Now recall, last year was the first year where the district laid out 5 years of capital projects and programming. And the Parks, Rec, and Culture Department had been through the budgeting process. They were asked to pivot very quickly and prepare a 5-year plan. They did that, but they've had the opportunity over the last year to update some of their estimates. And that's what is some of what we're presenting here today. One of the items that we want to discuss here is the Henderson roof. So that's proposed for $266,000 in 2023, and that's to replace the gym portion of the roof. There aren't a lot of changes outside of that. We have highlighted some changes, but they're relatively minor, and they just represent life cycle replacement of existing capital in that program. So the next part of the Parks, Rec, and Culture budget to discuss is the page 111, which is the vehicles and equipment replacement program. As noted, the Oak Bay chiller has increased in price from the previous financial plan. However, the majority of this is grant funded now, $525,000. So the net cost of the district has fallen significantly. Another major item is the Oak Bay Rec Center air unit. Based on recent examples of the cost of this capital in the region, staff are recommending a budget of $817,000 at this time. And the last item to note on this program is the fitness equipment. In 2021, the Parks, Rec, and Culture Department is recommending that some of its cycling infrastructure be replaced this year. And then in 2024 would be a full-scale cardio equipment replacement of all equipment. Both of those the cardio equipment has a 3 to 4 year lifespan, whereas the spin bike equipment has a longer lifespan. And then the last program to review in detail is the Parks, Rec, and Culture Parks and Playground program. One of the new items here is the Cattle Point Maritime Meadow protective fencing. Right now, there's an open area between the sea and the parking lot that contain a very rare type of meadow. There's 8 endangered plant species that are there, and the meadow is currently under severe strain, and with the danger of many of those species being lost. So staff are recommending an investment of $40,000 to protect that area. Other items on this list include some of the playgrounds. The Parks, Rec, and Culture Department has refreshed some of the pricing for some of the playgrounds. However, the playgrounds will depend highly on council input, because playgrounds can really be scaled to whatever size and scope that council and the community want. So when it comes time to replace those playground, further community engagement and council engagement will be essential. Also, the Carnarvon Park design has been deferred to 2025 in recognition that the Parks, Rec, and Culture Master Plan had been deferred to 2024. Thank you, Your Worship. That will conclude the Parks, Rec, and Culture Capital Plan presentation. We're available for any questions.
Thank you very much. And I know we have, I think we have Mr. Herman on the line as well. If there's any specific questions, go ahead, Councillor Patterson, then Appleton.
Thank you, Mayor. We just finished talking about climate action initiatives. So certainly, as I look at the chiller replacement, which we received a grant for, and that's great. But the indoor refrigerated buildings are definitely not known to be wonderful climate or environmental buildings. And so I'm wondering, this is the chiller that's being replaced is a significant piece of equipment. Energy emissions certainly are a consideration, and there's nothing in the report that talks about what this project might bring in terms of better environmental emission controls with the replacement of the dated cooling equipment. So if staff could perhaps just give a couple of quick comments on that,
Sure.
I'd really
Mr.
appreciate
Herman,
it.
Mr. Herman, can you just provide an update of the impacts of the new chiller?
Sure, Your Worship. Are you able to hear me?
We can. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, the nice thing about this project is it's going to benefit us in the community in a number of ways. It's a different type of chiller that we'll be installing. We're going to go from a shell and tube chiller to a plate and frame chiller. That's going to reduce the ammonia load by roughly 70%. It's going to be much more efficient. It's going to be much safer. If, obviously we're hopeful that our safety protocols that are in place will ensure that we never have an unfortunate leak or incident. But if we were to have that significantly lower charge will reduce and mitigate the potential for a poor result. Included in this project are replacement of a lot of piping that's starting to leak. Some of it's original to the building from the 70s. You can imagine that when you have pinhole leaks and welds and things like that, the system is not operating as efficiently as it could. There's also going to be variable drive motors on brine pumps, things like that. So it's not just the replacement of a chiller, but that chiller is going to be more efficient. The associated piping and infrastructure around that chiller is going to be much more efficient. So our electricity load is going to be significantly reduced. Basically, the whole thing is going to be significantly more efficient and safer.
Thank you. I really appreciate knowing that. I think at least it's a positive step forward for the environment. Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead, Councillor Appleton.
Thank you, Your Worship, and through you to staff, just putting on my library board trustee hat here. We had obviously some flooding in the library branch this past year through roof leaks and some roof impacts. And so I was just wondering whether or not I'm not sure what the scope of work for repairs was required and whether or not that potentially sat within the Monterey building maintenance line item here, or how that was being accounted for.
Sure. Thank you, Councillor Appleton. Mr. Herman, you probably are most in touch with this, but if not, it may have to go over to engineering.
Sure, Your Worship, I can answer that. The work that needed to be done was addressed through the operating budget. There is a library maintenance line item in the Monterey operating budget. So our staff were over there along with contractors to deal with what had taken place, and I have not heard anything from our facility operations coordinator that there was significant repairs or damage that would need to be encompassed within the capital plan. So I think we've been able to address it through the operating budget.
Thank you very much, Mr. Herman. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, thank you, Your Worship. I just wanted to ensure that there wasn't a significant enough repair that required a capital budget line item.
Perfect. Thank you. I don't see any other questions on this area, so let's move on to the next section, Mr. Payne.
Thank you, Your Worship. What we'll do now is we'll go through the public works equipment replacement budget, then the sanitary sewer utility, then the water utility, and we'll loop back around to engineering general. Let me bring up the screen here.
If I could just ask that you share the page name, so if those following at home in the version 4 of the draft financial plan attached to the agenda, they can go to that page number and see what might not be very readable on the screen.
Yeah, you bet, Your Worship. So page 103 in the draft financial plan version 4.
Great,
so
thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Your Worship. I'm just going to go through some of the changes here. The public works equipment replacement budget just represents replacement of existing capital. Doesn't represent any increase in service levels. A note that in the 2020 through 2024 financial plan, it was forecast about $3.4 million in replacement, and that's very close to what's being forecasted here as well. We're in an era of replacement right now. A significant amount of this equipment is being replaced. As you see, $1.9 million approximately just in this year. The period directly after this financial plan doesn't show a significant replacement era such as this. So our reserve balances will remain stable and we believe sustainable for the long term to support this. There are some minor changes overall. So, a couple of projects have been increased a little bit. Unit number 72 has increased by $30,000. That's on a $340,000 budget. And some units have been taken out of the schedule and some units have been accelerated in their priority in the schedule. The last thing I'll note on this capital plan is unit number 41, which is the garbage truck replacement at the bottom. So that's come in to this plan into year 5 for $405,000. That vehicle is expected to be replaced every 5 years. So it is a significant capital expenditure every 5 years. So you'll see that in future iterations. That'll be it for the Public Works capital budget, Your Worship. I can either continue on to sanitary, sewer, and water utility or pause here for questions.
If I might just make for the sake of clarification, because this conversation happens every time we talk about vehicles in particular. These pricings that are in here are essentially attached to what's available now, which is primarily fuel-based vehicles. Technology is changing quite rapidly. So I know we've got essentially guidelines to move over to electric or hybrid as quickly as possible. Where these would be impacted by price differences, if there was an electric version of that would say cost more than is in our budget. This is a 5-year financial plan, so we're looking in future years. That'll just be flagged for an option in those years. Is that correct?
Your Worship, that is correct, and I have confirmed with the manager of parks that his equipment replacement has been integrated into this plan as it is, and that does include consideration of reduced emission equipment as well, as we've had that discussion previously. So if there is a price difference and a decision to be had, that would be flagged for council. Yeah.
Okay. I just think it's worthwhile for the public to see as well that one of the advantages of doing this longer term capital planning is it allows us the opportunity to see those cumulative cost impacts and our long-term operational cost impacts and measure some of the benefits and costs attached to making those changes. But also when those changes happen, it's more visible because we're doing it as changes to a 5-year plan as opposed to year over year. So I appreciate that clarification. Any other questions on this, or I'm happy to just move on to the next item and we'll deal with all of the capital works together. Go ahead, Councillor Patterson.
Yes, thank you for those comments, Mayor. I think just as a suggestion for future budgets, because we are talking about climate emergency and we do have a sustainable procurement policy now. And so for future budgets, perhaps if we, with staff's knowledge, they could flag any major purchases or projects that create energy or environmental mitigation, just to flag for people, because I think that it's an important issue going forward, and it would be a quick glance for people as they read these reports to understand that. So just a quick suggestion.
For future versions, yes, not for this one.
Yeah, you don't have to go back for this one, but for future.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Patterson. I don't see any other hands up, so why don't you continue, Mr. Payne?
Thank you, Your Worship. We'll move to the sanitary sewer utility budget on page 105 of the draft financial plan version 4. This is a pretty status quo budget from when you compare it to the 2020 5-year financial plan. An extra $200,000 has been added to the 2022 sewer main replacement budget. And there's also $250,000 proposed in studies is detailed right here.
Just for the record, Mr. Payne, I have this as page 106
Yes.
on just if anybody's following at home, and just it says 105 at the bottom of the page, but it says 106 in terms of the day of the pages of the PDF. So if people are at home trying to follow, thanks. Sorry, keep going.
You got it. That's absolutely right. Yes. So just an extra. There's $250,000 proposed in studies that would result in potentially new assets for a sanitary sewer. And your worship, if you don't mind, I'm just going to go down to the water utility and continue there, which has some more substantive changes than the sanitary sewer. So it's PDF page 107. It'll say 106 at the bottom of the financial plan. Again, fairly status quo for most of the items. An extra $100,000 proposed in 2021 for water main replacement. A significant jump in a water main replacement proposed for 2022. This should really be highlighted for council and public. So $2.3 million spend. That's a result of some of the capital programming that has resulted from last year's capital programming. And then also a significant expenditure on replacing the North Oak Bay pump station and consolidate some of the pump stations there and the water main replacement around that area as well. So some significant capital replacement that's being proposed, and both of those projects are really coming out of the capital program that was conducted last year. I think that's a good place to pause, your worship.
Thank you very much, Mr. Payne. Any questions? Just one quick question. Have we done any preliminary looking at potential grants opportunities for the pump station consolidation? I'm assuming that we're going to try and find some grants for that if possible.
Your worship, yeah, we're continuously keeping an eye out for that, and part of that is having shovel-ready projects, which is why some funding is being proposed in the years 2021 and 2022. So we have a shovel-ready project if those grant opportunities become available.
Very good. Thank you very much, Mr. Payne. Any questions on this? Okay, please continue, Mr. Payne.
Okay, where we'll finish, your worship, is at the engineering capital budget, the general capital budget. And we started getting into this budget last week and had some robust conversation about it. So I'm just scrolling to that page right now, which is on page PDF 98 or page 97 at the bottom of the financial plan. We took a moment to discuss most of the facilities capital program items last budget meeting. One of the items we didn't get to, I believe, is the 1538 Monterey capital repairs. The district's entered a lease and has committed to doing some external work on that property. The lessee is responsible for internal maintenance on that budget. We're also recommending a facilities contingency. I think there's more work to be done with council on defining when contingency can be used. There's a contingency that's been proposed in the Parks, Rec and Culture budget. However, we've integrated it here in anticipation for the bylaw adoption. In terms of stormwater sewer rehabilitation, we've increased the cost slightly, fairly status quo with previous years. There is an additional $270,000 proposed for actually new assets. The majority of this would be along Victoria Avenue, where stormwater assets don't exist right now, and that would support our commitment to reducing flow in our sanitary system, and actually use a storm system for that flow. And another large new capital item that's being proposed in this financial plan is the McNeil Bay or McVicken Point shoreline protections. The first couple of years proposed in this project would be studies to present council with option. So the $1.2 million expenditure is really not defined at this point. It's put in there for council to notice and for the public to notice. However, when those options come forward, whatever council decides with respect to those options would really determine what the capital cost would be. Your Worship, I think that's a good place to pause.
You may not know this off the top of your head, but if I might ask, what is the status of the McNeil Bay shoreline protection reserve? Because there's been money being set aside over many years now to kind of address a known problem that's coming. Do we know what that number is?
Your Worship, I could probably figure it out if you gave me 2 minutes, but not off the top of my head, no.
It's not necessary for the financial plan process, so I'll leave it for now. I just thought I'd ask if you had it at your fingertips. Go ahead, Councillor Zelka, and I'll go to a few questions here, but I just appreciate one of the members of the public, Ms. Shaw, has been waiting for a very long time to speak, and this is the area she wanted to speak to, so I'll go to a couple councillors, and I'm just going to go to Ms. Shaw and let her have a chance to talk to us. So go ahead, Councillor Zelka, and then Councillor Patterson, and then I'll go to Ms. Shaw.
Thank you very much, Chair. Question here, it's in particular around McNeil Bay and some other areas by the water. I understand we're in the midst of a sea level rise study, a process through the CRD. I'm wondering if we have any indication at this point, or when we may have some indication as to some of the infrastructure projects we may have to implement as a result of that study that's slowly rolling out.
Thank you, Councillor Zelka. Mr. Haran is probably the best person to speak to that, and if he hasn't fallen asleep in the background, I'll let him answer the question.
I'm here, Your Worship. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you fine, thank you.
So yeah, with the new babies at home, I've had a lot of coffee tonight, so I think I'm wide awake here. So I don't have the full answer in terms of the impact of the sea level rise study. I think Mr. Anderson, if he's still around, might have better speak to that study itself. I mean, I've seen read parts of it and haven't fully digested it myself, but I can speak to the McNeil Bay project and that area and the foreshore infrastructure. They are connected, and part of the options analysis and the concept work that has to happen in the next 2 years here, and the work we need to do in terms of showing the council and the community what could happen there. They have to incorporate these questions of climate change, and that's a pretty standard thing to do in terms of engineering analysis of what potential solutions might happen. So that's part of the reason why we need to move forward with this work, and we'll have to incorporate that information as best we can in the process.
Thank you, Mr. Haran. Thank you, Councillor Zelka. Before I actually move on, I just recognizing we have a few more things to get through, and it's we're nearing up on our 10 o'clock mandated end time. So if I could just get a motion to extend this meeting till 10:30, that saves us and we'll do everything we can in our power to complete this meeting by that time.
I'll make the motion to extend to 10:30.
Moved and seconded. Any discussion? Not seeing any. All those in favor? Opposed? None opposed. Thank you. I am actually going to go to, if you don't mind, Councillor Patterson, to Ms. Shaw. I think it's just discourteous not to get to her before our mandated cutoff time here. So, Ms. Shaw, you've been waiting very patiently as to address council on issues. So, you're more than welcome to speak to us at this point. Welcome.
Thank you, Mayor Murdoch, and thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you again. And please use my voice. I hope you can hear me. It's a little rusty tonight. Firstly, I want to say congratulations to all of you this International Women's Day, and to compliment Oak Bay once again for the diversity on your council, and I hope equity amongst the council as well. So congratulations on that. I won't take very long this evening. I have communicated in paper with all of you, but I did just want to follow up on the presentation I made on the 18th of February on behalf of my husband, Norm, and I. Firstly, I just want to encourage you and your staff that during this budget year is the time to provide direction on the McNeil corridor, and make it a priority in our planning and the allocation of funding. It's important to, I think, to all of us that we mitigate the repeated occurrences of flooding and adapting to the climate changes. And I've really enjoyed some of the conversation and some of the debate this evening around some of those issues, and compliment you on that. We do really request a couple of things, just to follow up on my previous comments, that was really impressed, and I haven't had a chance to talk to Councillor Peterson, Your Worship, but I did want to compliment her on the motion that I see on your agenda for this evening. And if I were a councillor, I certainly would be supporting that, and I'll leave that with you. We do want to ask you to please direct the staff that the stormwater master plan, which is scheduled for completion in as you know, in the fall of 2022, that it be moved up. And that if we need to engage support to do that, that we do that, that we would like to see this completed by the fall of 2021. And as we requested at our meeting, or at your meeting on February the 18th, we would really like to have you develop a communication plan that would inform us and other residents of the interim maintenance plan for the protection of our homes and our properties. We know we've seen a lot of activity happening just in the last 2 or 3 weeks in the area, but we have no idea what that activity is and how it might assist us in protecting our property. Because becoming even more important as we're attempting to get flood and water insurance for our home, which we don't have and have been declined by our insurance company. And so we're now beginning the shopping to see whether we can. We have, as I know I shared with some of you, we have ticked every box on the checklist that has been developed by the Interim Insurance Climate Adaptation Center at the University of Waterloo, one that I encourage all of us to look at. So we have done our part. Now I need to be able to show the insurance companies that Oak Bay is doing their part. It's really critically important. We've suffered over $150,000 in 8 years in flooding on our properties, and it just cannot continue. So we ask you, whatever is happening, to please inform us so that we can have some peace, that we understand what's happening. If we just see trucks out there, we have no idea what's happening. So a communication strategy to the community I think would be something that would be really very valuable, and sort of allow the people that are doing the work to know that work is understood and is being recognized. And we'd also like to ask you to inform us again of the status of the timeline to undertake the permanent upgrade and replacement. We hear all kinds of conversations about reserves and so on, but that isn't telling us anything about when we might see this work completed, or at least the shovels go in the ground. I keep hearing about shovel ready, and I'd love to hear that with this particular subject. So I thank you. I won't go any farther, but just to emphasize that there are some needs that are really very important to us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Ron. Thanks for your patience to wait to have a chance to speak. It's a long evening to be watching. Yes, right. Inexpensive entertainment, at least. So, all right. So thank you for that. So back to Councillor Patterson. You're muted currently, Councillor Patterson.
Sorry, it's getting late. I think this is about the time I get into my examination normally, but if staff could, through you, Mayor, if staff could help me understand how the breakdown is occurring on the facilities capital program, because initially, of course, this was all introduced in the Moore-Wilson report on municipal buildings. All of the municipal buildings were rolled into that one report, which was kind of nice because you had a look at it all. But of course, now it's broken down into different sections. Some might make sense to me. Others are a bit more confusing of how they end up in whatever bucket they go in. So if somebody could perhaps shed some light on how that determination is made, that would be helpful. I think it also goes back to Councillor Braithwaite's comment at the last meeting about, why does the fire department get charged for the generator for both the police and the fire? So it's sometimes a little confusing as to how some of this ends up in the category it ends up in.
Thank you, Councillor Patterson. Mr. Payne, probably give it to you. If you want to give it to someone else, I'll let you do so.
Your worship, sorry, I'm trying to understand the question a bit better. I apologize for that. Are we being asked how components of the facilities program are funded, and whether they're funded by certain portions of our reserves and how that is determined? Is that a fair summary?
Well, it through you, Mayor, it certainly, it does get to that, but really, I guess it comes down to, we also are going to be staffing for a facilities manager. And although I guess in the world I came from, you'd have building managers and facility managers would look after something that's very different from this. So that's perhaps why I'm a little confused, but it really, yeah, how will that person be responsible for all municipal buildings, or will some be looked after by different departments? And then is that how they get categorized within the budgets and get the funding for whatever projects are going on?
Well, thank you, Councillor Patterson.
So it's a bit broader than just the funding.
And if we can get a reasonably short answer as much as possible, Mr. Payne.
Yes, thank you, Your Worship, for that clarification. And I'm actually just going to ask Mr. Haran to provide some insight there.
All right, Mr. Haran, see if that coffee's paying off.
Thank you, Your Worship. I think the question actually speaks fundamentally to the reason why we created the program manager facilities and asset management position and created that function, which may end up growing within engineering and public works, because prior to this year, those responsibilities for the various departments were spread out or not held by anybody in particular. So Parks and Recreation, for example, has a very mature and well-developed life cycle management plan for the resources for the facilities, whereas and fire department has a little bit better, but then there's other departments or other buildings that are just completely not really dealt with or touched for way too long. So the staff back in the Moore and Associates report time, brought all that forward to say this is an issue, but this is the solution. So part of the my department's role now is to try to figure out how to solve some of these problems, where to fund them from, which to prioritize, and that's what the facilities master plan does, and also the work that this new function, the folks that we're intending to bring in to start addressing some of these questions and try to make sense of this challenge that's in front of us that hasn't yet been dealt with the way it needs to be.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Haran. I don't have anybody else on a speaking list on the capital pieces. Is there any other questions or comments? Councillor Appleton.
Thank you, Your Worship. Just for point of procedure, I guess, there's a sort of separate active transportation component attached to this. So I'm just wondering, at what point is that going to get dealt with? Are we going to deal with that specifically, or how is that wrapped into this discussion?
It is part of the report, so if you want to address it, this is a reasonable time to do so.
Okay, so it's acceptable to sort of ask some specific questions about the active transportation program update that's been provided here.
Yes.
Okay. Then through you to staff, just with respect to active transportation, and thank you, Mr. Haran and crew, for preparing what is a comprehensive report, and I appreciate all the content that's in here. I just wanted to specifically ask with respect to the McNeil corridor, and we're talking about McNeil from a different aspect, but McNeil, I'm curious about it from an active transportation perspective. We had acknowledged last meeting that the Henderson bike lane being installed on the Victoria side would have a direct implication on what we would need to do with McNeil. So I wanted to ask the Director of Engineering whether or not we had in place the necessary resources and the necessary staff allocation to be evaluating what may need to be done with McNeil in both, the short, medium term with respect to safety improvements and flow of traffic, given that we're going to have the Richardson bike lane installed.
Thank you, Councillor Appleton. Mr. Haran, I'm going to hand this over to you in terms of those details, and again, probably related as much to the budget as much as as well as the plan itself.
Yes, thank you, Your Worship. The answer is we do have the work related to assessing the future of McNeil from a transportation perspective, at least in terms of answering this question, as part of not explicitly in the program as you see it in the report that's attached. However, so that does mean though that we're taking it from an operating perspective, at least in terms of concepts analysis and feasibility, and then trying to plan our next iterations of the capital program. And then we're always taking in new information and trying to reprioritize and figure out what we're going to be doing in the future. And there is also a little bit of capital room that as the year goes on, some projects often come in under budget, or we get ICBC grants. So that gives us a little bit of flexibility within the capital program to start using that to get a jump on next year's. So our intention is as the City of Victoria does their work on Richardson, we can start gathering the data of what the impacts are on like positive and negative on the Oak Bay side, and then start putting together some ideas on what changes we might make to address the future of McNeil.
Go ahead, Councillor Appleton.
Thank you, Your Worship. I appreciate that. As council is aware, residents that live along much in the same way that residents are flagging for us the issues with stormwater infrastructure along that road. Similarly, residents are also flagging issues with transportation safety. Council's in receipt of some suggestions from the community that could be used to address safety through that corridor. So I hope that when we're doing that analysis of the McNeil corridor, that we take that into account. And just one further question, Your Worship.
Go ahead.
Just with respect, I wanted to confirm with the director of engineering, through you and to the director, I just wanted to confirm that there is a line item here under the active transportation program, specifically speaking to updating the active transportation strategy. Council's aware that we have the 2011 active transportation strategy, and I'm just seeking to confirm that the update that is proposed here is to essentially evolve that plan to get us towards the recommendation from the Climate Action Work Group in terms of getting us towards an actual conceptual plan and some budget numbers around the active transportation network. And that's sort of rather than a replacement document, it's an evolution that gets us towards the goals of recommendation number 1 of the Climate Action Work Group.
Sure. Thank you, Councillor Appleton. And I think there's a 2025 aspirational effort on that portion as well. Mr. Haran?
Yes, thank you, Your Worship. It's definitely that work is meant to build on the work that's already been done. So it's not taking a whole new fresh approach. It's definitely taking the active transportation strategy from 2011 and that aspect that was incorporated into the OCP and taking that and turning it into actionable projects. So there's a bunch of, and the report that's in the agenda tonight really talks about it in more detail. There's unanswered questions and undone feasibility and concept work around right-of-way requirements and feasibility of certain kinds of active transportation infrastructure. We need to get into those weeds. And now that we've had the direction from the council to do that kind of work, we can kind of move ahead, which allows us then to talk about options in a more concrete way in terms of costs and feasibility and what those projects might look like, so that we can seek some guidance from the council in terms of timelines and budgets and priorities.
Thank you, Mr. Haran. Looking for any, I don't see any other hands at this point. So there is a recommendation here on the capital budget presentations that the staff proceed with the capital improvement programs as laid out. You have the motion in front of you. It's probably worth putting that motion on the table for 6.4, and then we can have a further discussion. Councillor Braithwaite, you're moving it. Is there a seconder? Moved and seconded. Thank you. Any other comments or questions at this point? I think go ahead, Councillor Appleton.
Thank you, Your Worship. Just very briefly, I guess I would I would note that as staff have pointed out in their report, this is one of the many things that's been delayed through COVID, and there's been a lot of exigencies on staff in this past year, and I think we all recognize that. I guess I would just encourage council to, cast their minds forward into subsequent years. That it's positive that we've included active transportation in the capital budget, and it should be. The line item that is presented here is very likely going to need to be expanded in subsequent years to accomplish a real goal in this regard. So what we have here is essentially, in my opinion, a placeholder for what we're going to need in the future.
Thank you, Councillor Appleton. I'm just going to ask the question of, I think the question was asked by Ms. Shaw about the possibility of moving up the asset management for stormwater. My understanding is that that is sort of actively underway. I'm not sure, Mr. Horan, can you just talk a little bit about like what are the options for that? Like, is that a contract we have? Where is that sitting in terms of getting that the stormwater plan completed?
Yes, thank you for the question, Your Worship. A couple of things to think about when assessing that one. The first one is the priorities that the council has considered in terms of over multiple years now kind of reflect the priorities have been water, so clean water and water infrastructure, and then sewer, because sanitary sewer. Not to say that stormwater is not as important, but it was prioritized differently based on the direct impact to public health. And so that's why in the program since the 2016, 2017 timeframe, and now with the master plans in the program, that's why sanitary sewer is currently happening. That's why water has already occurred with another refresh coming, and why sanitary or storm sewer was kind of in the 2022 timeframe. The biggest thing that's happening that affects the timeline is the 2015 decision around closed circuit television cameraing of the mains and the timelines and the budgets approved for that. So at that time, in 2015, it was a 5-year sanitary sewer program and a 10-year storm sewer program. So we are still, we're getting closer to being towards the end of the storm sewer program. But if we were to try to do more, there's an aspect of contracting out the CCTV, which is doable. But we are, as I mentioned in the report that's on the agenda tonight, our staff in terms of operating and capital are currently at the max of what we can do. So to try to add managing a storm sewer master plan, right now without trying to figure out how to deprioritize something else or adding staff would be a challenge. And adding staff is not something we just do with a snap of the fingers. It would be because right away, even with contractor support, it requires in-house staff to manage those. So we are moving as quickly as we can, but it would require a significant thought process to try to accelerate one aspect of the infrastructure program without really fundamentally discussing what it means to the other parts of the infrastructure program that aren't being talked about at the moment, including water, transportation, sanitary sewer, etc. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, it does. I appreciate that clarity. I just, I feel this sense of urgency from, honestly, not just McNeil. There's been flooding that's happened in pockets throughout the municipality during these big rainstorms, and all of them who've had damage and dealt with those emergencies are feeling that same sense of urgency. And so I don't want to in any way indicate that that's not a high priority. It is, and I think your point made about the staffing is a critical one, and that's, if you look at where we've gone, we started the funding of the capital, now we've done hiring of 2 new people within the engineering department, plus a number of field workers to actually do the work. So we're scaling up that ability, but it's not something you can do on a turn of a button. It's got to be planned, or else we're going to dig ourselves a bigger financial hole than we can possibly afford. So I don't want to not acknowledge the concerns and the sense of urgency that's been raised, but also just how important it is that we do this right, because we don't have the funding to do it wrong once, and I wish we had started this 10 years ago. The next best option is to do it now, so we're doing it now. So that motion is on the floor. Is there any other discussion on the motion? I'm not seeing any, so I'm going to call the question. All those in favor? Any opposed? None opposed. Thank you very much for that. This moves us over to the item number 6.5, which in the previous version of the agenda was on item 4. This is the notice of motion from Councillor Patterson. This is the one item in this section that isn't a public input portion, so it's just really for council discussion. And I know this touches on a number of aspects that have been brought forward by staff in terms of updating us on some aspects. So I'll leave it to Councillor Patterson what she wishes to do with this motion, how far down the path we've come, and if the motion stands or if she wishes to modify it or otherwise. So Councillor Patterson, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. And I certainly appreciate the responses I've had from staff and their input on these things, and certainly the segment tonight on asset management. But the reason for my motion is, of course, I too am concerned in about the residents and some of what they are experiencing from flooding and just general disrepair of infrastructure. So we know it's been building, and there has been quite a lengthy time, as Mr. Haran pointed out. The stormwater has been 10 years, so these plans have been long underway. I will perhaps consider amending the motion. Should I read it all out? Or
I think what we should do, just procedurally, to make this as clean as possible and as efficient as possible, is you could read the therefore be it resolved, and then we'll take any motions to amend from that written document.
Okay, thank you. Be it therefore resolved, the council directs staff to augment information in the draft 2021 to 2025 financial plan to harmonize terminology and correlate capital funding proposed in the draft financial plan proportionately to the recommended scope of work contained in the asset management strategy to provide greater transparency on intended results.
It's the second. Okay, so it's moved and seconded. Go ahead, Councillor Patterson.
Okay, so the reason that I brought this forward, well, two reasons. I certainly respecting our practice that this is in fact a council directed budget, and it's not a councillor directed budget. But my motion recognizes that the financial plan is one of several documents that inform council decisions, and to demonstrate accountability to residents. Truly, Director Payne deserves a lot of credit in the transformational changes he's made to the financial plan. I think we all agree and appreciate his work on this, but without making it into a much more massive document, it is more manageable to I think still look at all of the documents. And sometimes the residents are not as familiar with those documents, but we do have the draft financial plan. We have our asset management plans, we have our annual report, and we have our corporate plan. So each document is required, I think, to have a coherent understanding and strategy for where the district wants to be in the future and to meet our mission statement. As stated in the draft financial plan, actually on page 10, a key deliverable of the asset management program will be decision-making tools which enable council to manage infrastructure risk as a core part of capital planning. The risks and capital costs anticipated for the district's cumulative infrastructure deficit, as Mr. Payne addressed tonight, they're not factored yet into the 5-year financial plan. However, the impact on taxes will be significant. The 5-year financial plan, we've come a long way on capital infrastructure projects, sustainability funding for reserves, and improved maintenance, all steps in the right direction. But the asset management plan in whole or in part is key to council's responsibility of managing risk and flowing out of that, managing the long-term capital plan. My concern in what we're seeing, yes, remarkable improvements in information that we're getting, but we're making changes to adopt new programs or expand existing programs without council having the full picture of what the impact is going to be on future tax structures when the accumulated infrastructure deficit rolls into this. As well, in order to understand risk, you have to be able to understand what the conditions are. Right now, the OPUS report was mentioned in one of the tools we use, but that's an engineered design estimate of the life expectancy of the systems. It's critical to have the asset management reporting in order to identify the condition. Some infrastructure can go many years beyond the design, the engineered design estimate of useful life. So how do we piece it all together? We really need the asset management plan. And I think we are at a critical tipping point where council needs to see what we have to date. It may not be and will never be a full plan, because as the years go on, we're going to keep adding to it. But we need to understand where we are. We need to understand what we do know about risk now, so that we can use it to guide also the consideration of what we want to do for funding. Right now, our policy for funding for capital is really a pay-as-you-go plan. And that might fit into the sustainable funding, but there is every possibility that we're going to have to secure longer term funding. And we're beyond the halfway mark in this council's term. And in order for council to understand the risk and determine what alternatives they want to start looking at for how to fund this growing debt,
So,
we need
Patterson,
to have that.
I just want to, just in the interest of time here as well, I appreciate the summary of the rationale.
So that's kind of it. Yeah.
So the motion as it's sitting here is to augment information in this financial plan. I think are all these aspects here you're still expecting some changes to happen to this financial plan, or are you? I'm just trying to get some clarification so council understands what the motion actually says.
I would have hoped to have been able to obtain the information to actually inform this financial plan. In discussions with staff and certainly in the presentation tonight, my understanding is that we are not going to have that information perhaps to inform this financial plan, but as Mr. Payne indicated, even by passing this, it does not limit us totally to not making decisions along the way. So I would propose that I amend the motion, but recognize that I still feel the motion is in order to have the instruction to staff actually adopted as a resolution so that it gets into the action plan and it is firm in coming back to council. But I could amend the plan to, in fact, receive to direct staff to report on the output and measures in the district asset management strategy by June 2021, and further direct staff to report on the district infrastructure replacement plan by September 2021, so that if we need to make decisions, there is still some time to do it in the last quarter of this year, and certainly that we have it well ahead of the next budget planning cycle.
Okay, we're going to need that in writing. Do you have it somewhere that you can share it on your screen? And we're going to need a motion to extend this meeting further, and it's got to be unanimous to move forward. But we do, at the end of the day, have to have a motion to sort of move the financial plan forward as well before we leave. So it's an important meeting to actually get to. So if I might just have a motion to extend by, say, 15 minutes to 10:45. Moved and seconded. Is there any discussion on that? All right, call the question. All those in favor? Any opposed? Let's do everything we can to keep it in this time frame if at all possible. I'm just going to point out it may be worthwhile if this is a motion to ask for information in the Q2 and in the fall. It may be something that we can actually, defer it to another meeting because it's not necessary if it's just that kind of an ask. But perhaps if you could share your motion up on the screen, at least we can see it and consider what we do with it after that.
I can't really because it's all in the midst of another paper and it's
Okay.
highlighted. So unfortunately, I
wonder if we could defer this to another meeting because we're getting pushed for time. People are tired. We've got to get the budget thing through. So I would make a motion that we defer this to another meeting because I think it's worth the discussion, Councillor Patterson. It's just I don't think that's worth rushing and people are tired.
Yeah, I agree. And I think this is an important issue. So I would certainly.
I'm just going to go through to process here. So we have a motion to refer to a future council meeting. I think it's probably general enough we can come back to it. I take that as a second, Councillor Patterson. I agree. So it's moved and seconded to refer to a future this motion to a future council meeting. And it's really the motion. It's the whole motion with the amendment suggested. So we'll just take the whole piece forward. I just want to make sure I'm not stepping out of bounds here, Ms. Williams. Is it okay to refer a motion that's currently in the midst of an amendment motion?
If you do, Your Worship, you'll be deferring the motion as it was presented on the agenda tonight. It has not yet been amended.
No, it's been moved and seconded to be amended. So we haven't yet debated the amendment motion. So I just want to make sure I'm okay in the midst of an amendment motion to refer it, or I just want to make sure it doesn't cause any procedural problems. I don't think it should, but I just want to make sure I'm not in any issue here. We're essentially referring an amendment motion, which is a bit confusing.
Yes, it is. What we can do, Your Worship, is we can defer the motion as it was presented and provide it to council at a future meeting with a notation on what the proposed amendment was.
I think that's an appropriate process. So is that amendable to the mover and seconder? I'm getting a yeses. I'll take it as a yes from Councillor Naya and Councillor Patterson. So the motion will be referred in its original form with a note with the motion to amend to go with it. Perfect. So that's fairly clear. Any other discussion on this motion to refer? Not seeing any. All those in favor? Any opposed? None opposed. Okay, thank you for that. I appreciate your amenity there, Councillor Patterson. It changed the urgency once that amendment was made, so I think that makes a lot of sense to deal with that more fulsomely at the right time. I just want to make sure I've got my appropriate bits and pieces here, so forgive me for a second. Sorry, I've got so many pieces of data open right now. I got to find my pieces. I just want to, I'll just turn to staff. Under 6.5 under budget wrap up, is there anything else that we want to go through? I think we need a motion basically to say, okay, this concludes this process, and this motion will, and this financial plan as laid out here will go forward to be built into a bylaw. I just want to I'm just talking about procedure here, Councillor Appleton, before I go any further. Unless you're still on you wouldn't be on 6.5. So this is now 6.6. Is there procedurally? I just want to make sure I've got this right. Mr. Payne.
Yeah, Your Worship, we have a proposed motion that staff be directed to prepare the 2021 through 2025 financial plan bylaw by incorporating all committee direction.
Okay, thank you for that. So before we get to that motion, I'm just going to go to Councillor Appleton.
Thank you, Your Worship. I just received some communication that I guess that there was a member of the public that was expecting a call for public input at the end of item 6.4, and I apologize for not flagging it to you before that. I just received it after 6.4 was concluded. So
No problem. If
I'm
they,
not sure whether that's even feasible at this stage of the game, but I did want to at least flag that it was received.
it's just capital budget presentations. So if someone wishes to call in at this point, we're on 6.6 now, but it's still subject to public input. So we can take a call. So I don't mind. We can certainly put the motion on the floor here, and then because we can always go back and make, well, Councillor Appleton, are you letting that person know that they can call in?
Well, I've just let them know that I would let you, I let them know that I would let you know, Your Worship.
Okay, so why don't we give them a chance to call in on this one? With council's indulgence, we can maybe just, can I just table this item then, 6.6 for a moment, and we can just go to the new business, because I think Councillor Green wanted to just make a notice of motion to let us know that she will be bringing a motion next month that fulfills our procedural obligations.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Mayor.
Actually, I think I have to have a motion to table this briefly. So can I just have a motion to table 6.6 temporary, moved and seconded? Any discussion? All those in favor? Any opposed? Not opposed. Thank you. So now to item 7, Councillor Green.
Yes, thank you very much, Mayor. And just to let everyone know that I will be bringing a motion to council that involves reaching out to the Songhees and the Esquimalt nations related to reconciliation and building a stronger relationship between our communities.
Great. Thank you very much, Councillor Green. Look forward to that motion when it comes back. Well, then, any other new business? Not seeing any, so we'll move back to, if I can have a motion to lift from the table item 6.6. Moved and seconded. Any discussion? All those in favor? Any opposed? Not opposed. I've lost Councillor Nay's visual, so there we go. I know it's late. We'll try to get this wrapped up. So we did invite the public to call in on 6.4 or any other item on the agenda. Is there anybody that's called in, Ms. Williams?
No, Your Worship, not at this time.
They may have given up when we passed 6.4, Councillor Appleton. If they do call in, they just have to hit *9 to raise their hand, and anytime before the end of the meeting, I will still take that call in for comment. Ultimately, the decision on these things is dealt with at the financial bylaw stage, but certainly this is the right meeting to have any input. So if you are watching and you wish to call in, please do so. Ms. Williams, if you don't mind putting up the call-in number again, I'm just going to ask again for the motion to table this item. Actually, why don't we get the motion on the table on the floor, moved and seconded, and then we'll table it at that point. So, Mr. Payne, can you just read aloud that motion that you would like us to have?
Yes, Your Worship. That staff be directed to prepare the 2021 through 2025 financial plan bylaw by incorporating all committee direction.
So it's moved and seconded. Thank you. I'm going to now ask for a motion to table that and go to item number 8, and then before you come back. Moved and seconded to table. Any discussion? All those in favor? Any opposed? Not opposed. Sorry, I'm going fast here, but I want to just deal with these things and give someone, the person who wishes to call, a chance. So that moves us to item number 8.1, correspondence from the District of Saanich on the overdose crisis. This is a bit of a procedural piece, but also can allow for some direction from council as well, as noted. Councillor Appleton, you have your hand raised.
Thank you, Your Worship. With your indulgence, I would actually like to make a motion to refer this item to a further council meeting, to a later council meeting. I think that there is some discussion that needs to happen around this topic. I obviously favor receiving the correspondence, but I would like to have a discussion at the council table about some of the contents.
A motion to refer to a future meeting is always in order if it's seconded. Okay, moved and seconded. It is debatable. Is there any other discussion on this? If that's the will of council, that's fine. So I will then call the question. All those in favor? Any opposed? Not opposed. So that is now referred to a future meeting. Thank you, Councillor Appleton. We will come back to item 6.6 on the budget on the agenda. We have a motion to lift from the table. Moved and seconded. Thank you. All those in favor? Any opposed? Not opposed. Thank you. So we're now live again on the motion to give direction for the financial plan bylaw. Ms. Williams, I don't see any new callers calling in. Ms. Williams, on my screen, is there anybody who's called in and raised their hand?
No, your worship, nobody.
Okay, so Councillor Appleton, as always, we take public input, and it's right up to the financial plan process. So if they wish to address it to council, let's just ask them to do that in writing. It's the simplest way, and then we'll have that information.
Thank you, your worship.
Thank you. And I know I can only imagine how hard it would be to sit through this and call in at the right time. So my apologies to those people who have that problem. So with that, any discussion on the motion? Not seeing any, I'll call the question then. All those in favor? Any opposed? None opposed. Thank you very much. And that moves us to adjournment.
Move adjournment.
Moved and seconded. Thank you. All those in favor? Any opposed? None opposed. Thank you very much for your staying awake and all your time and thought on this. A late meeting, but necessary to get done. So thank you, everyone. We'll see you next week.